Section 21 of the Brown Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Brown Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. Kisa the Cat. Once upon a time there lived a queen who had a beautiful cat, the color of smoke, with china blue eyes, which she was very fond of. The cat was constantly with her, and ran after her wherever she went, and even sat up proudly by her side when she drove out in her fine glass coach. "Oh, Pussy," said the queen one day, "you are happier than I am, for you have a dear kitten just like yourself, and I have nobody to play with but you." "Don't cry," answered the cat, laying her paw on her mistress's arm. "Crying never does any good. I will see what can be done." The cat was as good as her word. As soon as she returned from her drive, she trotted off to the forest to consult a fairy who dwelt there, and very soon after the queen had a little girl who seemed made out of snow and sunbeams. The queen was delighted, and soon the baby began to take notice of the kitten as she jumped about the room, and would not go to sleep at all unless the kitten lay curled up beside her. 2 or 3 months went by, and though the baby was still a baby, the kitten was fast becoming a cat. And one evening, when as usual the nurse came to look for her to put her in the baby's cot, she was nowhere to be found. What a hunt there was for that kitten, to be sure! The servants, each anxious to find her, as the queen was certain to reward the lucky man, searched in the most impossible places. Boxes were opened that would hardly have held the kitten's paw. Books were taken from bookshelves lest the kitten should have gotten behind them. Drawers were pulled out, for perhaps the kitten might have got shut in. But it was all no use. The kitten had plainly run away, and nobody could tell if it would ever choose to come back. Years passed away, and one day when the princess was playing ball in the garden, she happened to throw her ball farther than usual, and it fell into a clump of rose bushes. The princess, of course, ran after it at once, and she was stooping down to feel if it was hidden in the long grass, when she heard a voice calling her. "Ingiborg, Ingiborg," it said, "have you forgotten me? I am Kisa, your sister." "But I never had a sister," answered Ingiborg, very much puzzled, for she knew nothing of what had taken place so long ago. "Don't you remember how I always slept in your cot beside you, and how you cried till I came? But girls have no memories at all. Why, I could find my way straight up to that cot this moment, if I was once inside the palace." "Why did you go away, then?" asked the princess. But before Kisa could answer, Ingiborg's attendants arrived breathless on the scene, and were so horrified at the sight of a strange cat that Kisa plunged into the bushes and went back into the forest. The princess was very much vexed with her ladies-in-waiting for frightening away her old playfellow, and told the queen, who came to her room every evening to bid her good night. "Yes, it is quite true what Kisa said," answered the queen. "I should have liked to see her again. Perhaps some day she will return, and then you must bring her to me." Next morning it was very hot, and the princess declared that she must go play in the forest, where it was always cool, under the big shady trees. As usual, her attendants let her do anything she pleased, and sitting down on a mossy bank where a little stream tinkled by, soon fell sound asleep. The princess saw with delight that they would pay no heed to her, and wandered on, expecting every moment to see some fairies dancing around a ring, or some little brown elves peeping at her from behind a tree. But alas! she met none of these. Instead, a horrible giant came out of his cave and ordered her to follow him. The princess felt much afraid, as he was so big and ugly, and began to be sorry that she had not stayed within reach of help. But as there was no use in disobeying the giant, she walked meekly behind. They went a long way, and Ingiborg grew very tired, and at length began to cry. "I don't like girls who make horrid noises," said the giant, turning round. "But if you want to cry, I will give you something to cry for." And drawing an axe from his belt, he cut off both her feet, which he picked up and put in his pocket. Then he went away. Poor Ingiborg lay on the grass in terrible pain, and wondering if she should stay there till she died, as no one would know where to look for her. How long it was since she had set out in the morning she could not tell. It seemed years to her, of course, but the sun was still high in the heavens when she heard the sound of wheels, and then with a great effort, for her throat was parched with fright and pain, she gave a shout. "I am coming," was the answer, and in another moment a cart made its way through the trees, driven by Kisa, who used her tail as a whip to urge the horse to go faster. Directly Kisa saw Ingiborg lying there. She jumped quickly down, and lifting the girl carefully in her two front paws, laid her upon some soft hay, and drove back to her own little hut. In the corner of the room was a pile of cushions, and these Kisa arranged as a bed. Ingiborg, who by this time was nearly fainting from all she had gone through, drank greedily some milk, and then sank back on the cushions while Kisa fetched some dried herbs from a cupboard, soaked them in warm water, and tied them on the bleeding legs. The pain vanished at once, and Ingiborg looked up and smiled at Kisa. "You will go to sleep now," said the cat, "and you will not mind if I leave you for a little while. I will lock the door, and no one can hurt you." But before she had finished, the princess was asleep. Then Kisa got into the cart which was standing at the door, and catching up the reins, drove straight to the giant's cave. Leaving her cart behind some trees, Kisa crept gently up to the open door, and, crouching down, listened to what the giant was telling his wife, who was at supper with him. "The first day that I can spare I shall just go back and kill her," he said. "It would never do for people in the forest to know that a mere girl can defy me." And he and his wife were so busy calling Ingiborg all sorts of names for her bad behavior that they never noticed Kisa stealing into a dark corner and upsetting a whole bag of salt into the great pot before the fire. "Dear me, how thirsty I am!" cried the giant by and by. "So am I," answered the wife. "I do wish I had not taken that last spoonful of broth. I am sure something was wrong with it." "If I don't get some water, I shall die," went on the giant, and rushing out of the cave, followed by his wife, he ran down the path which led to the river. Then Kisa entered the hut, and lost no time in searching every hole till she came upon some grass, under which Ingiborg's feet were hidden, and putting them in her cart, drove back again to her own hut. Ingiborg was thankful to see her, for she had lain too frightened to sleep, trembling at every noise. "Oh, is it you?" she cried joyfully, as Kisa turned the key, and the cat came in, holding up the two neat little feet in their silver slippers. "In 2 minutes they shall be as tight as they ever were," said Kisa, and taking some strings of the magic grass, which the giant had carelessly heaped on them, she bound the feet on to the legs above. "Of course you won't be able to walk for some time. You must not expect that," she continued, "but if you are very good, perhaps in about a week I may carry you home again." And so she did. And when the cat drove the cart up to the palace gate, lashing the horse furiously with her tail, and the king and queen saw their lost daughter sitting beside her, they declared that no reward could be too great for the person who had brought her out of the giant's hands. "We will talk about that by and by," said the cat, as she made her best bow and turned her horse's head. The princess was very unhappy when Kisa left her without even bidding her farewell. She would neither eat nor drink, nor take any notice of all the beautiful dresses her parents bought for her. "She will die unless we can make her laugh," one whispered to the other. "Is there anything in the world that we have left untried?" "Nothing except marriage," answered the king, and he invited all the handsomest young men he could think of to the palace, and bade the princess choose a husband from among them. It took her some time to decide which she admired the most, but at last she fixed upon a young prince, whose eyes were like the pools in the forest, and his hair of bright gold. The king and the queen were greatly pleased, as the young man was the son of a neighbouring king, and they gave orders that a splendid feast should be got ready. When the marriage was over, Kisa suddenly stood before them, and Ingiborg rushed forward and clasped her in her arms. "I have come to claim my reward," said the cat. "Let me sleep for this night at the foot of your bed." "Is that all?" asked Ingiborg, much disappointed. "Is it enough?" answered the cat. And when the morning dawned, it was no cat that lay upon the bed, but a beautiful princess. "My mother and I were both enchanted by a spiteful fairy," said she. "We could not free ourselves till we had done some kindly deed that had never been wrought before. My mother died without ever finding a chance of doing anything new, but I took advantage of the evil act of the giant to make you as whole as ever." Then they were all more delighted than before, and the princess lived in the court until she, too, married and went away to govern one of her own. End of Kisa the Cat.
Section 22 of the Brown Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Grace Garrett. The Brown Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. The Lion and the Cat. Far away, on the other side of the world, there lived, long ago, a lion and his younger brother, the wild cat, who were so fond of each other that they shared the same hut. The lion was much the bigger and stronger of the two. Indeed, he was much bigger and stronger than any of the beasts that dwelt in the forest, and besides, he could jump farther and run faster than all the rest. If strength and swiftness could gain him dinner, he was sure never to be without one. But when it came to cunning, both the grizzly bear and the serpent could get the better of him, and he was forced to call in the help of the wild cat. Now the young wild cat had a lovely golden ball, so beautiful that you could hardly look at it except through a piece of smoked glass, and he kept it hidden in the thick fur muff that went around his neck. A very large old animal, since dead, had given it to him when he was hardly more than a baby, and had told him never to part with it, for as long as he kept it, no harm could ever come near him. In general, the wild cat did not need to use his ball, for the lion was fond of hunting, and could kill all the food they needed. But now and then his life would have been in danger had it not been for the golden ball. One day the two brothers started to hunt at daybreak, but as the cat could not run nearly as fast as the lion, he had quite a long start. At least he thought it was a long one, but in a very few bounds and springs the lion reached his side. "There is a bear sitting on that tree," he whispered softly. "He is only waiting for us to pass to drop down on my back." "Ah, you are so big that he does not see that I am behind you," answered the cat, and touching the ball he just said, "Bear, die," and the bear tumbled dead out of the tree and rolled over just in front of them. For some time they trotted on without any adventures, till just as they were about to cross a strip of dead grass on the edge of the forest, the lion's quick ears detected a faint rustling noise. "That is a snake!" he cried, stopping short, for he was much more afraid of snakes than of bears. "Oh, it is all right," answered the cat. "Snake, die." And the snake died, and the two brothers skinned it. Then they folded the skin up into a very small parcel, and the cat tucked it into his mane, for snake skins can do all sorts of wonderful things, if you are lucky enough to have one of them. All this time they had had no dinner, for the snake's flesh was not nice, and the lion did not like eating bear, perhaps because he never felt sure that the bear was really dead, and would not jump up alive when his enemy went near him. Most people are afraid of something, and bears and serpents were the only creatures that caused the lion's heart to tremble. So the two brothers set off again, and soon reached the side of a hill, where some fine deer were grazing. "Kill one of those deer for your own dinner," said the boy brother, "but catch me another alive. I want him." The lion at once sprang towards them with a loud roar, but the deer bounded away, and they were all three soon lost to sight. The cat waited for a long while, but finding that the lion did not return, went back to the house where they lived. It was quite dark when the lion came home, where his brother was sitting curled up in one corner. "Did you catch a deer for me?" asked the boy brother, springing up. "Well, no," replied the man brother. "The fact is that I did not get up to them till we had run halfway across the world, and left the wind far behind us. Think what a trouble it would have been to drag it here, so I just ate them both." The cat said nothing, but he did not feel that he loved his big brother. He had thought a great deal about that deer, and had meant to get on his back to ride him as a horse, and to go see all the wonderful places the lion talked to him about when he was in a good temper. The more he thought about it, the more sulky he grew, and in the morning, when the lion said that it was time for them to start to hunt, the cat told him that he might kill the bear and snake by himself, as he had a headache and would rather stay at home. The little fellow knew quite well that the lion would not dare to go out without him and his ball for fear of meeting a bear or a snake. The quarrel went on, and for many days neither of the brothers spoke to each other. And what made them still more cross was that they could get very little to eat, and we know that people are often cross when they are hungry. At last it occurred to the lion that if he could only steal the magic ball, he could kill bears and snakes for himself, and then the cat might be as sulky as he liked for anything that it would matter. But how was the stealing to be done? The cat had the ball hung around his neck day and night, and he was such a light sleeper that it was useless to think of taking it while he slept. No, the only thing was to get him to lend it of his own accord, and after some days the lion, who was not at all clever, hit upon a plan he thought would do. "Dear me, how dull it is here," said the lion one afternoon, when the rain was pouring down in such torrents that, however sharp your eyes or your nose might be, you could not spy a single bird or beast among the bushes. "Dear me, how dull, how dreadfully dull I am! Couldn't we have a game of catch with that golden ball of yours?" "I don't care about playing catch, as it does not amuse me," answered the cat, who was as cross as ever, for no cat, even to this day, ever forgets an injury done to him. "Well, then, lend me the ball for a while, and I will play by myself," replied the lion, stretching out a paw as he spoke. "You can't play in the rain, and if you did, you would only lose it in the bushes," said the cat. "Oh, no, I won't. I will play in here. Don't be so ill-natured." And with a very bad grace the cat untied the string and threw the golden ball into the lion's lap, and composed himself to sleep again. For a long while the lion tossed it up and down gaily, feeling that, however sound asleep the boy brother might look, he was sure to have one eye open. But gradually he began to edge closer to the opening, and at last gave such a toss that the ball went up high into the air, and he could not see what became of it. "Oh, how stupid of me!" he cried, as the cat sprang up angrily. "Let us go out at once and search for it. It really can't have fallen very far." But though they searched that day and the next after that, they never found it, because it never came down. After the loss of his ball, the cat refused to live with the lion any longer, but wandered away to the north, always hoping he would meet with his ball again. But months passed and years passed, and though he travelled over hundreds of miles, he never saw any traces of it. At length, when he was getting quite old, he came to a place unlike that he had ever seen before, where a big river rolled right to the foot of some high mountains. The ground all about the river bank was damp and marshy, and as no cat likes to wet his feet, this one climbed a tree that rose high above the water, and thought sadly of his lost ball, which would have helped him out of this horrible place. Suddenly he saw a beautiful ball, for all the world like his own, dangling from a branch of the tree he was on. He longed to get at it, but was the branch strong enough to bear his weight? It was no use, after all he had done, getting drowned in the water. However, it could do no harm, and if he was to go a little way, he could always manage to get back somehow. So he stretched himself at full length upon the branch, and wriggled his body cautiously along. To his delight it seemed thick and stout. Another movement, and by stretching out his paw he would be able to draw the string towards him, when the branch gave a loud crack, and the cat made haste to wriggle himself back the way he had come. But when cats make up their mind to do anything, they generally do it, and this cat began to look about to see if there was really no way of getting at his ball. Yes, there was, and it was much surer than the other, though rather more difficult. Above the bough where his ball was hung was another bough much thicker, which he knew could not break with his weight, and by holding on tight to this with all four paws, he could just manage to touch the ball with his tail. He would thus be able to whisk the ball to and fro till, by and by, the string would come quite loose, and it would fall to the ground. It might take some time, but the lion's little brother was patient, like most cats. Well, it all happened just as the cat intended it should, and when the ball dropped to the ground, the cat ran down the tree like lightning, and picking it up, tucked it away in the snake skin around his neck. Then he began jumping along the shore of the big water from one place to another, trying to find a boat, or even a log of wood that would take him across. But there was nothing. Only, on the other side, he saw 2 girls cooking, and though he shouted to them at the top of his voice, they were too far off to hear what he said. And what was worse, the ball suddenly fell out of its snakeskin right back into the river. Now, it is not at all an uncommon thing for balls to tumble into rivers, but in that case they generally either fall to the bottom and stay there, or else bob about on the top of the water, close to where they first touched it. But this ball, instead of doing either of those things, went straight across to the other side, and there one of the girls saw it when she stooped to dip some water into her pail. "Oh, what a lovely ball!" cried she, and tried to catch it with her pail, but the ball always kept bobbing just out of her reach. "Come and help me!" she called to her sister, and after a long while they had the ball safe inside the pail. They were delighted with their new toy, and one or the other held it in her hand till bedtime came, and then it was long time before they could make up their minds where it would be safest for the night. At last they locked it in a cupboard in one corner of their room, and as there was no hole anywhere, the ball could not possibly get out. After that they went to sleep. In the morning the first thing they both did was to run to the cupboard and unlock it. But when the door opened they started back, for instead of the ball there stood a handsome young man. "Ladies," he said, "how can I ever thank you for what you have done for me? Long, long ago I was enchanted by a wicked fairy, and condemned to the shape of a ball, till I could meet with 2 maidens, who would take me to their own home. But where was I to meet them? For hundreds of years I have lived in the depths of the forest, where nothing but wild beasts ever came, and it was only when the lion threw me into the sky that I was able to fall to the earth near this river. Where there is a river, sooner or later people will come, so hanging myself on a tree I watched and waited. For a moment I lost heart when I fell once more into the hands of my old master, the wild cat, but my hopes rose again as I saw he was making for the river bank opposite where you were standing. That was my chance, and I took it. And now, ladies, I have only to say that, if I ever can do anything to help you, go to the top of that high mountain and knock 3 times at the iron door at the north side, and I will come to you." So, with a low bow, he vanished from before them, leaving the maidens weeping at having lost in one moment both the ball and the prince. End of The Lion and the Cat. Recording by Grace Garrett.
Section 23 of The Brown Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Brown Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. Which was the foolishest? In a little village that stood on a wide plain, where you could see the sun from the moment he rose to the moment he set, there lived 2 couples side by side. The men, who worked under the same master, were quite good friends, but the wives were always quarreling, and the subject they quarreled most about was, which of the 2 had the stupidest husband. Unlike most women, who think that anything that belongs to them must be better than what belongs to anyone else, each thought her husband the more foolish of the 2. "You should just see what he does," one said to her neighbor. "He puts on the baby's frock upside down, and one day I found him trying to feed her with boiling soup, and her mouth was scalded for days after. Then he picks up stones in the road and sows them instead of potatoes, and one day he wanted to go into the garden from the top window, because he declared it was a shorter way than through the door." "That is bad enough, of course," answered the other, "but it is really nothing to what I have to endure every day from my husband. If, when I am busy, I ask him to go and feed the poultry, he is certain to give them some poisonous stuff instead of their proper food, and when I visit the yard next I find them all dead. Once he even took my best bonnet when I had gone away to my sick mother, and when I came back I found he had given it to the hen to lay her eggs in. And you know yourself that only last week, when I sent him to buy a cask of butter, he returned driving 150 ducks which someone had induced him to take, and not one of them would lay." "Yes, I am afraid he is trying," replied the first, But let us put them to the proof, and see which of them is the most foolish." So, about the time that she expected her husband home from work, she got out her spinning wheel and sat busily turning it, taking care not even to look up from her work when the man came in. For some minutes he stood with his mouth open watching her, and as she still remained silent, he said at last, "Have you gone mad, wife, that you sit spinning without anything on the wheel?" "You may think that there is nothing on it," answered she, "but I can assure you that there is a large skein of wool, so fine that nobody can see it, which will be woven into a coat for you." "Dear me," he replied, "what a clever wife I have got! If you had not told me, I should never have known that there was any wool on the wheel at all. But now I really do seem to see something." The woman smiled and was silent, and after spinning busily for an hour more, she got up from her stoop and began to weave as fast as she could. At last she got up and said to her husband, "I am too tired to finish it tonight, so I shall go to bed, and tomorrow I shall only have the cutting and stitching to do." So the next morning she got up early, and after she had cleaned her house and fed her chickens and put everything in its place again, she bent over the kitchen table, and the sound of her big scissors might be heard snip, snap, as far as the garden. Her husband could not see anything to snip at, but then he was so stupid that was not surprising. After the cutting came the sewing. The woman patted and pinned and fixed and joined, and then, turning to the man, she said, "Now it is ready for you to try on." And she made him take off his coat and stand up in front of her, and once more she patted and pinned and fixed and joined, and was very careful in smoothing out every wrinkle. "It does not feel very warm," observed the man at last, when he had borne all this patiently for a long time. "That is because it is so fine," answered she. "You do not want it to be as thick as the rough clothes you wear every day." He did, but was ashamed to say so, and only answered, "Well, I am sure it must be beautiful, since you say so, and I shall be smarter than anyone in the whole village. What a splendid coat!" they will exclaim when they see me. But it is not everybody who has a wife as clever as mine. Meanwhile, the other wife was not idle. As soon as her husband entered, she looked at him with such a look of terror that the poor man was quite frightened. "Why do you stare at me so? Is there anything the matter?" asked he. "Oh, go to bed at once!" she cried. "You must be very ill indeed to look like that." The man was rather surprised at first, as he felt particularly well that evening. But the moment his wife spoke, he became quite certain that he had something dreadful the matter with him, and grew quite pale. "I dare say it would be the best place for me," he answered, trembling, and he suffered his wife to take him upstairs and help him off with his clothes. "If you sleep well during the night, there may be a chance for you," said she, shaking her head, as she tucked him up warmly. "But if not—" And of course the poor man never closed an eye till the sun rose. "How do you feel this morning?" asked the woman, coming in on tiptoe when her housework was finished. "Oh, bad, very bad indeed," answered he. "I have not slept for a moment. Can you think of nothing to make me better?" "I will try everything that is possible," said the wife, who did not in the least wish her husband to die, but was determined to show that he was more foolish than the other man. "I will get some dried herbs and make you a drink, but I am very much afraid that it is too late. Why did you not tell me before?" "I thought perhaps the pain would go off in a day or two, and besides, I did not want to make you unhappy," answered the man, who was, by this time, quite sure he had been suffering tortures and had borne them like a hero. "Of course, if I had had any idea how ill I really was, I should have spoken at once." "Well, well, I will see what can be done," said the wife, "but talking is not good for you. Lie still, and keep yourself warm." All that day the man lay in bed, and whenever his wife entered the room and asked him, with a shake of the head, how he felt, he always replied that he was getting worse. At last, in the evening, she burst into tears, and when he inquired what was the matter, she sobbed out, "Oh, my poor, poor husband, are you really dead? I must go tomorrow and order your coffin." Now, when the man heard this, a cold shiver ran through his body, and all at once he knew that he was as well as he had ever been in his life. "Oh, no, no," he cried, "I feel quite recovered. Indeed, I think I shall go out to work." "You will do no such thing," replied his wife. "Just keep quite quiet, for before the sun rises you will be a dead man." The man was very frightened at her words, and lay absolutely still while the undertaker came and measured him for his coffin, and his wife gave orders to the gravedigger about his grave. That evening the coffin was sent home, and in the morning at 9 o'clock the woman put him on a long flannel garment, and called to the undertaker's men to fasten down the lid and carry him to the grave, where all their friends were waiting them. Just as the body was being placed in the ground, the other woman's husband came running up, dressed, as far as anyone could see, in no clothes at all. Everybody burst out into shouts of laughter at the sight of him, and the men laid down the coffin and laughed too, till their sides nearly split. The dead man was so astonished at this behavior that he peeped out of a little window in the side of the coffin and cried out, "I should laugh as loudly as any of you if I were not a dead man." When they heard the voice coming from the coffin, the other people suddenly stopped laughing, and stood as if they had been turned into stone. Then they rushed with one accord to the coffin, and lifted the lid so that the man could step out amongst them. "Were you really not dead after all?" asked they. "And if not, why did you let yourself be buried?" At this, the wives both confessed that they had each wished to prove that her husband was stupider than the other. But the villagers declared that they could not decide which was the most foolish, the man who allowed himself to be persuaded that he was wearing fine clothes when he was dressed in nothing, or the man who let himself be buried when he was alive and well. So the women quarreled just as much as they did before, and no one ever knew whose husband was the most foolish. End of Which Was the Foolishest? Section 24 of The Brown Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Brown Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. Asmund and Signy. Long, long ago, in the days when fairies, witches, giants, and ogres still visited the earth, there lived a king who reigned over a great and beautiful country. He was married to a wife whom he dearly loved, and had 2 most promising children, a son called Asmund, and a daughter who was named Signy. The king and queen were very anxious to bring their children up well, and the young prince and princess were taught everything likely to make them clever and accomplished. They lived at home in their father's palace, and he spared no pains to make their lives happy. Prince Asmund dearly loved all outdoor sports and an open-air life, and from his earliest childhood he had longed to live entirely in the forest close by. After many arguments and entreaties, he succeeded in persuading the king to give him 2 great oak trees for his very own. "Now," said he to his sister, "I will have the trees hollowed out, and then I will make rooms in them and furnish them so that I shall be able to live out in the forest." "Oh, Asmund!" exclaimed Signy, "what a delightful idea! Do let me come too, and live in one of your trees. I will bring all my pretty things and ornaments, and the trees are so near home we shall be quite safe in them." Asmund, who was extremely fond of his sister, readily consented, and they had a very happy time together, carrying over all their pet treasures, and Signy's jewels and other ornaments, and arranging them in the pretty little rooms inside the trees. Unfortunately, sadder days were to come. A war with another country broke out, and the king had to lead his army against their enemy. During his absence, the queen fell ill, and after lingering for some time, she died, to the great grief of her children. They made up their minds to live all together for a time in their trees, and for this purpose they had provisions enough stored up inside to last them a year. Now I must tell you, in another country a long way off, there reigned a king who had an only son named Ring. Prince Ring had heard so much about the beauty and goodness of Princess Signy that he determined to marry her if possible. So he begged his father to let him have a ship for the voyage, set sail with a favorable wind, and after a time landed in the country where Signy lived. The prince lost no time in setting out for the royal palace, and on his way there he met such a wonderfully lovely woman that he felt he had never seen such beauty in all his life. He stopped her, and at once asked who she was. "I am Signy, the king's daughter," was the reply. Then the prince inquired why she was wandering about all by herself, and she told him that since her mother's death she was so sad that whilst her father was away she preferred being alone. Ring was quite deceived by her, and never guessed that she was not Princess Signy at all, but a strong, gigantic, wicked witch bent on deceiving him under a beautiful shape. He confided to her that he had travelled all the way from his own country for her sake, having fallen in love with the accounts he had heard of her beauty, and he then and there asked her to be his wife. The witch listened to all he said, and, much pleased, ended by accepting his offer. But she begged him to return to his ship for a little while, as she wished to go some way further into the forest, promising to join him later on. Prince Ring did as she wished, and went back to his ship to wait, whilst she walked on into the forest till she reached the 2 oak trees. Here she resumed her own gigantic shape, tore up the trees by their roots, threw one of them over her back and clasped the other to her breast, carried them down to the shore and waded out with them to the ship. She took care not to be noticed as she reached the ship, and directly she got on board, she once more changed to her former lovely appearance, and told the prince that her luggage was now all on board, and that they need wait for nothing more. The prince gave orders to set sail at once, and after a fine voyage landed in his own country, where his parents and his only sister received him with the greatest joy and affection. The false Signy was also very kindly welcomed. A beautiful house was got ready for her, and Prince Ring had the 2 oaks planted in the garden just in front of her windows, so that she might have the pleasure of seeing them constantly. He often went to visit the witch, whom he believed to be Princess Signy, and one day he asked, "Don't you think we might be married before long?" "Yes," said she, quite pleased. "I am quite ready to marry you whenever you like." "Then," replied Ring, "let us decide on this day fortnight. And see, I have brought you some stuff to make your wedding dress of." So saying, he gave her a large piece of the most beautiful brocade, all woven over with gold threads, and embroidered with pearls and other jewels. The prince had hardly left her before the witch resumed her proper shape and tore about the room, raging and storming and flinging the beautiful silk on the floor. What was she to do with such things? She roared. She did not know how to sew or make clothes, and she was sure to die of starvation into the bargain if her brother Ironhead did not come soon and bring her some raw meat and bones, for she really could eat nothing else. As she was raving and roaring in this frantic manner, part of the floor suddenly opened, and a huge giant rose up carrying a great chest in his arms. The witch was enchanted at this sight, and eagerly helped her brother to set down and open the chest, which was full of the ghastly food she had been longing for. The horrid pair set to, and greedily devoured it all, and when the chest was quite empty, the giant put it on his shoulder and disappeared as he had come, without leaving any trace of his visit. But his sister did not keep quiet for long, and tore and pulled at the rich brocade as if she wanted to destroy it, stamping about and shouting angrily. Now, all this time, Prince Asmund and his sister sat in their trees just outside the window, and saw all that was going on. "Dear Signy," said Asmund, "do try to get a hold of that piece of brocade, and make the clothes yourself, for really we shall have no rest day or night with such a noise." "I will try," said Signy. "It won't be an easy matter, but it's worth while taking some trouble to have a little peace." So she watched for an opportunity, and managed to carry off the brocade the first time the witch left her room. Then she set to work, cutting out and sewing as best she could, and by the end of 6 days she had turned it into an elegant robe, with a long train and a mantle. When it was finished, she climbed to the top of her tree and contrived to throw the clothes onto a table through the open window. How delighted the witch was when she found the clothes all finished! The next time Prince Ring came to see her, she gave them to him, and he paid her many compliments on her skilful work, after which he took leave of her in the most friendly manner. But he had scarcely left the house, when the witch began to rage as furiously as ever, and never stopped till her brother Ironhead appeared. When Asmund saw all these wild doings from his tree, he felt he could no longer keep silence. He went to Prince Ring and said, "Do come with me, and see the strange things that are happening in the new princess's room." The prince was not a little surprised, but he consented to hide himself with Asmund behind the paneling of the room, from where they could see all that went on through a little slit. The witch was raving and roaring as usual, and said to her brother, "Once I am married to the king's son, I shall be better off than now. I shall take care to have all that pack of courtiers put to death, and then I shall send for all my relations to come and live here instead. I fancy the giants will enjoy themselves very much with me and my husband." When Prince Ring heard this, he fell into such a rage that he ordered the house to be set on fire, and it was burnt to the ground, with the witch and her brother in it. Asmund then told the prince about the 2 oak trees, and took him to see them. The prince was quite astonished at them and at all their contents, but still more so at the extreme beauty of Signy. He fell in love with her at once, and entreated her to marry him, which, after a time, she consented to do. Asmund, on his side, asked for the hand of Prince Ring's sister, which was gladly granted him, and the double wedding was celebrated with great rejoicings. After this, Prince Asmund and his bride returned to his country to live with the king his father. The 2 couples often met, and lived happily for many, many years. And that is the end of the story. End of Asmund and Signy.
Section 25 of the Brown Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sukaina Jaffer. The Brown Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. Rubezahl. Over all the vast underworld, the mountain gnome Rubezahl was lord, and busy enough the care of his dominions kept him. There were the endless treasure chambers to be gone through, and the hosts of gnomes to be kept to their tasks. Some built strong barriers to hold back the fiery vapors, to change dull stones to precious metal, or were hard at work, filling every cranny of the rocks with diamonds and rubies. For Rubezahl loved all pretty things. Sometimes the fancy would take him to leave those gloomy regions and come out upon the green earth for a while, and bask in the sunshine and hear the birds sing. and as gnomes live many hundreds of years, he saw strange things. For the first time he came up the great hills were covered with thick forests, in which wild animals roamed, and Rubezahl watched the fierce fights between bear and bison, or chased the grey wolves, or amused himself by rolling great rocks down into the desolate valleys, to hear the thunder of their fall echoing among the hills. But the next time he ventured above ground, what was his surprise to find everything changed. The dark woods were hewed down, and in their place appeared blossoming orchards, surrounded cozy-looking thatched cottages. For every chimney the blue smoke curled peacefully into the air. Sheep and oxen fed in the flowery meadows, while from the shade of hedges came the music of the shepherd's pipe. The strangeness and the pleasantness of the sight so delighted the gnome that he never thought of resenting the intrusion of these unexpected guests, who without saying "by your leave" or "with your leave," had made themselves so very much at home upon his hills. Nor did he wish to interfere with their doings, but left them in quiet possession of their homes, as a good householder leaves in peace the swallows who have built their nests under his eaves. He was indeed greatly minded to make friends with this being called man. So taking the form of an old field laborer, he entered the service of a farmer. Under his care all the crops flourished exceedingly, but the master proved to be wasteful and ungrateful, and Rubezahl soon left him and went to be shepherd to his next neighbor. He tended the flock so diligently and knew so well where to lead the sheep to the sweetest pastures and where among the hills to look for any who strayed away, that they too prospered under his care, and not one was lost or torn by wolves. But this new master was a hard man and begrudged him his well-earned wages, so he ran away and went to serve the judge. Here he upheld the law with might and main, and was a terror to thieves and evildoers. But the judge was a bad man who took bribes and despised the law. Rubezahl would not be the tool of an unjust man, and so he told his master, who thereupon ordered him to be thrown in prison. Of course, that did not trouble the gnome at all. He simply got out through the keyhole and went away, down to his underground palace, very much disappointed by his first experience of mankind. But as time went on, he forgot the disagreeable things that had happened to him, and thought he would take another look at the upper world. So he stole into the valley, keeping himself carefully hidden in copse or hedgerow, and very soon met with an adventure. For peeping through a screen of leaves, he saw before him a green lawn, where stood a charming maiden, fresh as the spring and beautiful to look upon. Around her upon the grass lay her young companions, as if they had thrown themselves down to rest after some merry game. Beyond them flowed a little brook, into which a waterfall leapt from a high rock, filling the air with its pleasant sound and making a coolness even in the sultry noontide. The sight of the maiden so pleased the gnome that, for the first time, he wished himself a mortal, and longing for a better view of the gay company, he changed himself into a raven and perched upon an oak tree which overhung the brook. But he soon found that this was not all a good plan. He could only see with a raven's eyes, and feel as a raven feels. And a nest of field mice at the foot of the tree interested him far more than the sport of the maidens. When he understood this, he flew down again in a great hurry into the thicket, and took the form of a handsome young man. That was the best way. And he fell in love with a girl then and there. The fair maiden was the daughter of the king of the country, and she often wandered in the forest with her playfellows gathering the wild flowers and fruits, till the midday heat drove the merry band to the shady lawn by the brook to rest, or to bathe in the cool waters. On this particular morning, the fancy took them to wander off again into the wood. This was Master Rubezahl's opportunity. Stepping out of his hiding place, he stood in the midst of this little lawn, weaving his magic spells, till slowly all about him changed. And when the maidens returned at noon to their favorite resting place, they stood lost in amazement and almost fancied that they must be dreaming. The red rocks had become white marble and alabaster. The stream that murmured and struggled before in its rocky bed flowed in silence, now in its smooth channel from which a clear fountain leapt, to fall again in showers of diamond drops, now on this side, now on that, as the wandering breeze scattered it. Daisies and forget-me-nots fringed its brink, while tall hedges of roses and jasmine ringed it round, making the sweetest and daintiest bower imaginable. To the right and left of the waterfall opened out a wonderful grotto, its walls and arches glittering with many-colored rock crystals, while in every niche were spread out strange fruits and sweetmeats, the very sight of which made the princess long to taste them. She hesitated a while, however, scarcely able to believe her eyes, and not knowing if she could enter the enchanted spot or fly from it. But at length curiosity prevailed, and she and her companions explored to their heart's content, and tasted and examined everything, running hither and thither in high glee, and calling merrily to each other. At last, when they were quite weary, the princess cried out suddenly that nothing would content her but to bathe in the marble pool, which certainly did look very inviting. And they all went gaily to this new amusement. The princess was ready first, but scarcely had she slipped over the rim of the pool when down, down, down she sank, and vanished in its depths before her frightened playmates could seize her by so much as a lock of her floating golden hair. Loudly did they weep and wail, running about the brink of the pool, which looked so shallow and so clear, but which had swallowed up the princess before their eyes. They even sprang into the water and tried to dive after her, but in vain. They only floated like corks in the enchanted pool, and could not keep under water for a second. They saw at last that there was nothing for it but to carry to the king the sad tidings of his beloved daughter's disappearance. And what great weeping and lamentation there was in the palace when the dreadful news was told. The king tore his robes, dashed his golden crown from his head, and hid his face in his purple mantle for grief and anguish at the loss of the princess. After the first outburst of wailing, however, he took heart and hurried off to see for himself the scene of this strange adventure, thinking, as people will in sorrow, that there might be some mistake after all. But when he reached the spot, behold, all was changed again. The glittering grotto described to him by the maidens had completely vanished, and so had the marble bath, the bower of jasmine. Instead, all was a tangle of flowers, as it had been of old. The king was so much perplexed that he threatened the princess's playfellows with all sorts of punishments if they would not confess something about her disappearance. But as they only repeated the same story, he presently put down the whole affair to the work of some sprite or goblin, and tried to console himself for his loss by ordering a grand hunt. For kings cannot bear to be troubled about anything long. Meanwhile, the princess was not at all unhappy in the palace of her elfish lover. When the water nymphs, who were hiding in readiness, had caught her and dragged her out of the sight of her terrified maidens, she herself had not had time to be frightened. They swam with her quickly by strange underground ways to a palace so splendid that her father's seemed but a poor cottage in comparison with it. And when she recovered from her astonishment, she found herself seated upon a couch, wrapped in a wonderful robe of satin, fastened with a silken girdle, while beside her knelt a young man who whispered the sweetest speeches imaginable in her ear. The gnome, for he it was, told her all about himself and his great underground kingdom, and presently led her through the many rooms and halls of the palace, and showed her the rare and wonderful things displayed in them, till she was fairly dazzled at the sight of so much splendor. On 3 sides of the castle lay a lovely garden with masses of gay, sweet flowers and velvet lawns, all cool and shady, which pleased the eye of the princess. The fruit trees were hung with golden and rosy apples, and nightingales sang in every bush, as the gnome and the princess wandered in the leafy alleys, sometimes gazing at the moon, sometimes pausing to gather the rarest flowers for her adornment. And all the time he was thinking to himself that never during the hundreds of years he had lived had he seen so charming a maiden. But the princess felt no such happiness. In spite of all the magic delights around her, she was sad, though she tried to seem content for fear of displeasing the gnome. However, he soon perceived her melancholy, and in 1,000 ways strove to dispel the cloud, but in vain. At last he said to himself, "Men are sociable creatures, like bees or ants. Doubtless this lovely mortal is pining for company. Who is there I can find for her to talk to?" Thereupon he hastened into the nearest field and dug up a dozen or so of different roots, carrots, turnips, and radishes, and laying them carefully in an elegant basket brought them to the princess, who sat pensive in the shade of the rose bower. "Loveliest daughter of earth," said the gnome, "banish all sorrow. No more shall you be lonely in my dwelling. In this basket is all you need to make this spot delightful for you. Take this little many-colored wand, and with a touch give to each root the form you desire to see." With this he left her, and the princess, without an instant's delay, opened the basket, and touching a turnip, cried eagerly, "Brunilda, my dear Brunilda, come to me quickly." And sure enough, there was Brunilda, joyfully hugging and kissing her beloved princess, and chattering as gaily as in the old days. This sudden appearance was so delightful that the princess could hardly believe her own eyes, and was quite beside herself with the joy of having her dear playfellow with her once more. Hand in hand, they wandered about the enchanted garden, and gathered the golden apples from the trees, and when they were tired of this amusement, the princess led her friend through all the wonderful rooms of the palace, until at last they came to the one in which were kept all the marvelous dresses and ornaments the gnome had given to his hoped-for bride. There they found so much to amuse them that the hours passed like minutes. Veils, girdles, and necklaces were tried on and admired. The imitation Brunilda knew so well how to behave herself, and showed so much taste that nobody would have suspected that she was nothing but a turnip after all. The gnome, who had secretly been keeping an eye upon them, was very pleased with himself for having so well understood the heart of a woman, and the princess seemed to him even more charming than before. She did not forget to touch the rest of the roots with her magic wand, and soon had all her maidens about her, and even as she had 2 tiny radishes to spare, her favorite cat and her little dog, whose name was Benny. And now all went cheerfully in the castle. The princess gave to each of the maidens her task, and never was mistress better served. For a whole week she enjoyed the delight of her pleasant company undisturbed. They all sang, they danced, they played from morning to night. Only the princess noticed that day by day the fresh young faces of her maidens grew pale and wan, and the mirror in the great marble hall showed her that she alone still kept her rosy bloom, while Brunilda and the rest faded visibly. They assured her that all was well with them, but nevertheless they continued to waste away. And day by day it became harder to them to take part in the games of the princess, till at last, one fine morning, when the princess started from bed and hastened out to join her gay playfellows, she shuddered, and started back at the sight of a group of shriveled crones, with bent backs and trembling limbs, who supported their tottering steps with staves and crutches, and coughed dismally. A little nearer to the hearth lay the once frolicsome Benny, with all 4 feet stretched stiffly out, while the sleek cat seemed too weak to raise his head from his velvet cushion. The horrified princess fled to the door, to escape from the sight of this mournful company, and called loudly for the gnome, who appeared at once, humbly, anxious to do her bidding. "Malicious sprite," she cried, "why do you begrudge me my playmates, the greatest delight of my lonely hours? Isn't this solitary life in such a desert bad enough without your turning the castle into a hospital for the aged? Give my maidens back their youth and health this very minute, or I will never love you." "Sweetest and fairest of damsels," cried the gnome, "do not be angry. Everything that is in my power I will do. But do not ask the impossible. So long as the sap was fresh in the roots, the magic stuff could keep them in the forms you desired. But as the sap dried up, they withered away. But never trouble yourself about that, dearest one. A basket of fresh turnips will soon set matters right, and you can speedily call up again every form you wish to see. The great green patch in the garden will prove you with a more lively company." So saying, the gnome took himself off, and the princess with her magic wand touched the wrinkled old women, and left them the withered roots they really were, to be thrown upon the rubbish heap, and with light feet skipped off across to the meadow, to take possession of the freshly filled basket. But to her surprise, she could not find it anywhere. Up and down the garden she searched, spying into every corner, but not a sign of it was to be found. By the trellis of grapevines she met the gnome, who was so much embarrassed at the sight of her that she became aware of his confusion while he was still quite a long way off. "You are trying to tease me," she cried, as soon as she saw him. "Where have you hidden the basket? I have been looking for it, at least for an hour." "Dear queen of my heart," answered he, "I pray you to forgive my carelessness. I promised more than I could perform. I have sought all over the land for the roots you desire, but they are gathered in and lie drying in musty cellars, and the fields are bare and desolate. For below in the valley winter reigns, only here in your presence spring is held fast. And wherever your foot is set, the gay flowers bloom. Have patience for a little, and then without fail you shall have your puppets to play with." Almost before the gnome had finished, the disappointed princess turned away, and marched off to her own apartments, without deigning to answer him. The gnome, however, set off above the ground as speedily as possible, and disguising himself as a farmer, bought an ass in the nearest market town, and brought it back loaded with sacks of turnip, carrot, and radish seed. With this he sowed a great field, and sent a vast army of his goblins to watch and tend it, and to bring up the fiery rivers from the heart of the earth near enough to warm and encourage the sprouting seeds. Thus fostered, they grew and flourished marvelously, and promised a goodly crop. The princess wandered about the field day by day. No other plants or fruits in all her wonderful garden pleased her as much as these roots, but still her eyes were full of discontent, and best of all, she loved to while away the hours in a shady fir-wood, into which she would cast the flowers she had gathered and watch them float away. The gnome tried hard by every means in his power to please the princess and win her love, but little did he guess the real reason of his lack of success. He imagined that she was too young and inexperienced to care for him, but that was a mistake, for the truth was that another image already filled her heart. The young Prince Ratibor, whose lands joined her father's, had won the heart of the princess, and the lovers had been looking forward to the coming of their wedding day, when the bride's mysterious disappearance took place. The sad news drove Ratibor distracted, and as the days went on and nothing could be heard of the princess, he forsook his castle and the society of men, and spent his days in the wild forest, roaming about and crying her name aloud to the trees and rocks. Meanwhile, the maiden in her gorgeous prison sighed in secret over her grief, not wishing to arouse the gnome's suspicions. In her own mind she was wondering if by any means she might escape from her captivity, and at last she hit upon a plan. By this time spring once more reigned in the valley, and the gnome sent the fires back to their places in the deeps of the earth, for the roots which they had kept warm through all the cruel winter had now come to their full size. Day by day the princess pulled up some of them, and made experiments with them, conjuring up now this longed-for person, and now that, just for the pleasure of seeing them as they appeared. But she really had another purpose in view. One day she changed a tiny turnip into a bee, and sent him off to bring her some news of her lover. "Fly, dear little bee, towards the east," she said. "To my beloved Ratibor, softly hum into his ear that I love him only, but that I am captive in the gnome's palace under the mountains. Do not forget a single word of my greeting, and bring me back a message from my beloved." So the bee spread his shining wings and flew away to do as he was bidden. But before he was out of sight, a greedy swallow made a snatch at him, and to the great grief of the princess, her messenger was eaten up then and there. After that, by the power of the wonderful wand, she summoned a cricket and taught him this greeting. "Hop, little cricket, to Ratibor, and chirp in his ear that I love him only, but that I am held captive by the gnome in his palace under the mountains." So the cricket hopped off gaily, determined to do his best to deliver his message. But alas, a long-legged stork, who was prancing along the same road, caught him in her cruel beak, and before he could say a word, he had disappeared down her throat. These two unlucky ventures did not prevent the princess from trying once more. This time she changed the turnip into a magpie. "Flutter from tree to tree, chattering bird," said she, "till you come to Ratibor, my love. Tell him that I am captive, and bid him come with horses and men the third day from this to the hill that rises from the thorny valley." The magpie listened, hopped a while from branch to branch, and then darted away, the princess watching him anxiously as far as she could see. Now Prince Ratibor was still spending his life in wandering about the woods, and not even the beauty of the spring could soothe his grief. One day, as he sat in the shade of an oak tree, dreaming of his lost princess, and sometimes crying her name aloud, he seemed to hear another voice reply to his, and starting up, he gazed around him, but he could see no one, and he had just made up his mind that he must be mistaken, when the same voice called again, and looking up sharply, he saw a magpie, which hopped to and fro from the twigs. Then Ratibor heard with surprise that the bird was indeed calling him by name. "Poor chatterpie," said he, "who taught you to say that name, which belongs to an unlucky mortal who wishes the earth would open and swallow up him and his memory forever?" Thereupon he caught up a great stone, and would have hurled it at the magpie if it had not at that moment uttered the name of the princess. This was so unexpected that the prince's arm fell helplessly to his side at the sound, and he stood motionless. But the magpie in the tree, who, like all the rest of his family, was not happy unless he could be forever chattering, began to repeat the message the princess had taught him. And as soon as he understood it, Prince Ratibor's heart was filled with joy. All his gloom and misery vanished in a moment, and he anxiously questioned the welcome messenger as to the fate of the princess. But the magpie knew no more than the lesson he had learnt, so he soon fluttered away, while the prince hurried back to his castle to gather together a troop of horsemen full of courage for whatever might befall. The princess, meanwhile, was craftily pursuing her plan of escape. She left off treating the gnome with coldness and indifference. Indeed, there was a look in her eyes which encouraged him to hope that she might some day return his love, and the idea pleased him mightily. The next day, as soon as the sun rose, she made her appearance, decked as a bride, in the wonderful robes and jewels which the fond gnome had prepared for her. Her golden hair was braided and crowned with myrtle blossoms, and her flowing veil sparkled with gems. In these magnificent garments she went to meet the gnome upon the great terrace. "Loveliest of maidens," he stammered, bowing low before her, "let me gaze into your dear eyes, and read in them that you will no longer refuse my love, but will make me the happiest being the sun shines upon." So saying, he would have drawn aside her veil, but the princess only held it more closely about her. "Your constancy has overcome me," she said. "I can no longer oppose your wishes, but believe my words and suffer this veil still to hide my blushes and tears." "Why tears, beloved one?" cried the gnome anxiously. "Every tear of yours falls upon my heart like a drop of molten gold. Greatly as I desire your love, I do not ask a sacrifice." "Ah!" cried the false princess. "Why do you misunderstand my tears? My heart answers to your tenderness, and yet I am fearful. A wife cannot always charm, and though you will never alter, the beauty of mortals is as a flower that fades. How can I be sure that you will always be as loving and charming as you are now?" "Ask some proof, sweetheart," said he. "Put my obedience and my patience to some test, by which you can judge of my unalterable love." "Be it so," answered the crafty maiden. "Then give me just one proof of your goodness. Go. Count the turnips in yonder meadow. My wedding feast must not lack guests. They shall provide me with bride maidens too. But beware lest you deceive me, and do not miss a single one. That shall be the test of your truth towards me." Unwilling as the gnome was to lose sight of his beautiful bride for a moment, he obeyed her commands without delay, and hurried off to begin his task. He skipped along among the turnips as nimble as a grasshopper, and had soon counted them all. But to be quite certain that he had made no mistake, he thought he would just run over them again. This time, to his great annoyance, the number was different, so he reckoned them for the third time. But now the number was not the same as either of the previous ones, and this was hardly to be wondered at, as his mind was full of the princess's pretty looks and words. As for the maiden, no sooner was her deluded lover fairly out of sight than she began to prepare for flight. She had a fine fresh turnip hidden close at hand, which she changed into a spirited horse, all saddled and bridled, and springing upon its back, she galloped away over hill and dale till she reached the thorny valley, and flung herself into the arms of her beloved Prince Ratibor. Meanwhile, the toiling gnome went through his task over and over again, till his back ached and his head swam, and he could no longer put two and two together. But as he felt tolerably certain of the exact number of turnips in the field, big and little together, he hurried back, eager to prove to his beloved one what a delightful and submissive husband he would be. He felt very well satisfied with himself as he crossed the mossy lawn to the place where he had left her. But, alas, she was no longer there. He searched every thicket and path. He looked behind every tree and gazed into every pond, but without success. Then he hastened into the palace and rushed from room to room, peering into every hole and corner and calling her by name, but only echo answered in the marble halls. There was neither voice nor footstep. Then he began to perceive that something was amiss, and throwing off the mortal form that encumbered him, he flew out of the palace and soared high into the air, and saw the fugitive princess in the far distance, just as the swift horse carried her across the boundary of his dominions. Furiously did the enraged gnome fling 2 great clouds together and hurl a thunderbolt after the flying maiden, splintering the rocky barriers which had stood 1,000 years. But his fury was vain. The thunderclouds melted away into a soft mist, and the gnome, after flying about for a while in despair, bewailing to the 4 winds his unhappy fate, went sorrowfully back to the palace, and stole once more through every room with many sighs and lamentations. He passed through the gardens, which for him had lost their charm, and the sight of the princess's footprints on the golden sand of the pathway renewed his grief. All was lonely, empty, sorrowful, and the forsaken gnome resolved that he would have no more dealings with such false creatures as he had found men to be. Thereupon he stamped 3 times upon the earth, and the magic palace, with all its treasures, vanished away into the nothingness out of which he had called it, and the gnome fled once more to the depths of his underground kingdom. While all this was happening, Prince Ratibor was hurrying away with his prize to a place of safety. With great pomp and triumph he restored the lovely princess to her father, and was then and there married to her, and took her back with him to his own castle. But long after she was dead, and her children too, the villagers would tell the tale of her imprisonment underground, as they sat carving wood in the winter nights. Volksmärchen der Duschen. End of Rubezahl. Recording by Sukaina Jaffer. Toronto, Ontario, Canada.
Section 26 of the Brown Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wina Hathaway. The Brown Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. Story of the King Who Would Be Stronger Than Fate. Once upon a time, far away in the East Country, there lived a king who loved hunting so much that when once there was a deer in sight, he was careless of his own safety. Indeed, he often became quite separated from his nobles and attendants, and in fact was particularly fond of lonely adventures. Another of his favorite amusements was to give out that he was not well and could not be seen, and then, with the knowledge only of his faithful Grand Vizier, to disguise himself as a peddler, load a donkey with cheap wares, and travel about. In this way, he found out what the common people said about him, and how his judges and governors fulfilled their duties. One day, his queen presented him with a baby daughter as beautiful as the dawn, and the king himself was so happy and delighted that for a whole week he forgot to hunt and spent the time in public and private rejoicing. Not long afterwards, however, he went out after some deer which were to be found in a far corner of his forests. In the course of the beat, his dogs disturbed a beautiful snow-white stag, and directly he saw it, the king determined that he would have it at any cost. So he put the spurs to his horse and followed it as hard as he could gallop. Of course, all his attendants followed at the best speed that they could manage, but the king was so splendidly mounted, and the stag was so swift, that at the end of an hour the king found that only his favorite hound and himself were in the chase. All the rest were far, far behind and out of sight. Nothing daunted, however, he went on, till he perceived that he was entering a valley with great rocky mountains on all sides, and that his horse was getting very tired and trembled at every stride. Worse than all, evening was already drawing on, and the sun would soon set. In vain had he sent arrow after arrow at the beautiful stag. Every shot fell short or went wide of the mark, and at last, just as darkness was setting in, he lost sight altogether of the beast. By this time his horse could hardly move from fatigue. His hound staggered panting along beside him. He was far away amongst mountains where he had never been before, and had quite missed his way, and not a human creature or dwelling was in sight. All this was very discouraging, but the king would not have minded if he had not lost that beautiful stag. That troubled him a good deal, but he never worried over what he could not help. So he got down from his horse, slipped his arm through the bridle, and led the animal along the rough path in hopes of discovering some shepherd's hut, or at least a cave or shelter under some rock, where he might pass the night. Presently he heard the sound of rushing water, and made towards it. He toiled over a steep rocky shoulder of a hill, and there, just below him, was a stream dashing down a precipitous glen, and almost beneath his feet, twinkling and flickering from the level of the torrent, was a dim light as of a lamp. Towards this light the king with his horse and hound made his way, sliding and stumbling down a steep stony path. At the bottom the king found a narrow grassy ledge by the brink of the stream, across which the light from a rude lantern in the mouth of a cave shed a broad beam of uncertain light. At the edge of the stream sat an old hermit with a long white beard, who neither spoke nor moved as the king approached, but sat throwing into the stream dry leaves which lay scattered about the ground near him. "Peace be upon you," said the king, giving the usual country salutation. "And upon you, peace," answered the hermit, but still he never looked up, nor stopped what he was doing. For a minute or two the king stood watching him. He noticed that the hermit threw 2 leaves in at a time, and watched them attentively. Sometimes both were carried rapidly down by the stream. Sometimes only 1 leaf was carried off, and the other, after whirling slowly round and round on the edge of the current, would come circling back on an eddy to the hermit's feet. At other times both leaves were held in the backward eddy, and failed to reach the main current of the noisy stream. "What are you doing?" asked the king at last, and the hermit replied that he was reading the fates of men. Everyone's fate, he said, was settled from the beginning, and whatever it were, there was no escape from it. The king laughed. "I care little," he said, "what my fate may be, but I should be curious to know the fate of my little daughter." "I cannot say," answered the hermit. "Do you not know, then?" demanded the king. "I might know," returned the hermit, "but it is not always wisdom to know much." But the king was not content with this reply, and began to press the old man to say what he knew, which for a long time he would not do. At last, however, the king urged him so greatly that he said, "The king's daughter will marry the son of a poor slave girl called Puruna, who belongs to the king of the land of the north. There is no escaping from fate." The king was wild with anger at hearing these words, but he was also very tired, so he only laughed and answered that he hoped there would be a way out of that fate anyhow. Then he asked if the hermit could shelter him and his beasts for the night, and the hermit said yes. So very soon the king had watered and tethered his horse, and after a supper of bread and parched peas, lay down in the cave with the hound at his feet, and tried to go to sleep. But instead of sleeping, he only lay awake and thought of the hermit's prophecy, and the more he thought of it, the angrier he felt, until he gnashed his teeth and declared that it should never, never come true. Morning came, and the king got up, pale and sulky, and after learning from the hermit which path to take, was soon mounted and found his way home without much difficulty. Directly he reached his palace, he wrote a letter to the king of the land of the north, begging him as a favor to sell him his slave girl Peruna and her son, and saying that, if he consented, he would send a messenger to receive them at the river which divided the kingdoms. For 5 days he awaited the reply, and hardly slept or ate, but was as cross as he could be all the time. On the 5th day, his messenger returned with a letter to say that the king of the land of the north would not sell, but he would give the king the slave girl and her son. The king was overjoyed. He sent for the Grand Vizier and told him that he was going on one of his lonely expeditions, and that the Vizier must invent some excuse to account for his absence. Next he disguised himself as an ordinary messenger, mounted a swift camel, and sped away to the place where the slave girl was to be handed over to him. When he got there, he gave the messengers who brought her a letter of thanks and a handsome present for their master and rewards for themselves. And then without delay, he took the poor woman and her tiny baby boy up onto his camel and rode off to a wild desert. After riding for a day and a night, almost without stopping, he came to a great cave where he made the woman dismount, and, taking her and the baby into the cave, he drew his sword and with one blow chopped her head off. But although his anger made him cruel enough for anything so dreadful, the king felt that he could not turn his great sword on a helpless baby, who he was sure must soon die in this solitary place without its mother. So he left it in the cave where it was, and mounting his camel, rode home as fast as he could. Now in a small village in his kingdom, there lived an old widow who had no children or relations of any kind. She made her living mostly by selling the milk of a flock of goats, but she was very, very poor, and not very strong, and often used to wonder how she would live if she got too weak or ill to attend to her goats. Every morning she drove the goats out into the desert to graze on the shrubs and bushes which grew there, and every evening they came home of themselves to be milked and to be shut up safely for the night. One evening the old woman was astonished to find that her very best nanny goat returned without a drop of milk. She thought that some naughty boy or girl was playing a trick upon her, and had caught the goat on its way home and stolen all the milk. But when evening after evening the goat remained almost dry, she determined to find out who the thief was. So the next day she followed the goats at a distance and watched them while they grazed. At length, in the afternoon, the old woman noticed this particular nanny goat stealing off by herself away from the herd, and she at once went after her. On and on the goat walked for some way, and then disappeared into a cave in the rocks. The old woman followed the goat into the cave, and then what should she see but the animal giving her milk to a little baby boy, whilst on the ground near by lay the sad remains of the baby's dead mother. Wondering and frightened, the old woman thought at last that this little baby might be a son to her in her old age, and that he would grow up and in time to come be her comfort and support. So she carried home the baby to her hut, and next day she took a spade to the cave and dug a grave where she buried the poor mother. Years passed by, and the baby grew into a fine, handsome lad, as daring as he was beautiful, and as industrious as he was brave. One day, when the boy whom the old woman had named Nur Muhammad was about 17 years old, he was coming from his day's work in the fields when he saw a strange donkey eating the cabbages in the garden which surrounds their little cottage. Seizing a big stick, he began to beat the intruder and to drive him out of his garden. A neighbor passing by called out to him, "Hi, I say! Why are you beating the peddler's donkey like that?" "The peddler should keep him from eating my cabbages," said Nur Muhammad. "If he comes this evening here again, I'll cut off his tail for him." Whereupon he went off indoors, whistling cheerfully. It happened that this neighbor was one of those people who make mischief by talking too much. So, meeting the peddler in the sarai, or inn, that evening, he told him what had occurred, and added, "Yes, and the young Spitfire said that if beating the donkey would not do, he would beat you also and cut your nose off for a thief." A few days later, the peddler having moved on, 2 men appeared in the village inquiring who it was who had threatened to ill-treat and to murder an innocent peddler. They declared that the peddler, in fear of his life, had complained to the king, and that they had been sent to bring the lawless person who had said these things before the king himself. Of course, they soon found out about the donkey eating Nur Muhammad's cabbages, and about the young man's hot words, but although the lad assured them that he had never said anything about murdering anyone, they replied they were ordered to arrest him and bring him to take his trial before the king. So, in spite of his protests and the wails of his mother, he was carried off, and in due time brought before the king. Of course, Nur Muhammad never guessed that the supposed peddler happened to have been the king himself, although nobody knew it. But as he was very angry at what he had been told, he declared that he was going to make an example of this young man, and intended to teach him that even poor traveling peddlers could get justice in his country, and be protected from such lawlessness. However, just as he was going to pronounce some very heavy sentence, there was a stir in the court, and up came Nur Muhammad's old mother, weeping and lamenting, and begging to be heard. The king ordered her to speak, and she began to plead for the boy, declaring how good he was, and how he was the support of her old age, and if he were put in prison she would die. The king asked her who she was. She replied that she was his mother. "His mother?" said the king. "You are too old, surely, to have so young a son." Then the old woman, in her fright and distress, confessed the whole story of how she found the baby, and how she rescued and brought him up, and ended by beseeching the king for mercy. It is easy to guess how, as the story came out, the king looked blacker and blacker, and more grim, until at last he was half fainting with rage and astonishment. This, then, was the baby he had left to die, after cruelly murdering his mother. Surely fate might have spared him this. He wished he had sufficient excuse to put the boy to death, for the old hermit's prophecy came back to him as strongly as ever, and yet the young man had done nothing bad enough to deserve such punishment. Everyone would call him a tyrant if he were to give such an order. In fact, he dared not try it. At length, he collected himself enough to say, "If this young man will enlist in my army, I will let him off. We have need of such as him, and a little discipline will do him good." Still the old woman pleaded that she would not live without her son, and she was nearly as terrified at the idea of his becoming a soldier as she was at the thought of his being put in prison. But at length the king, determined to get the youth into his clutches, pacified her by promising her a pension large enough to keep her in comfort, and Nur Muhammad, to his own great delight, was duly enrolled in the king's army. As a soldier, Nur Muhammad seemed to be in luck. He was rather surprised, but much pleased, to find that he was always one of those chosen when any difficult or dangerous enterprise was afoot. And although he had the narrowest escapes on some occasions, still, the very desperateness of the situations in which he found himself gave him special chances of displaying his courage. And as he was also modest and generous, he became a favorite with his officers and his comrades, Thus it was not very surprising that, before very long, he became enrolled amongst the picked men of the king's bodyguard. The fact is that the king had hoped to have got him killed in some fight or another, but seeing that, on the contrary, he throve on hard knocks, he was now determined to try more direct and desperate methods. One day, soon after Nur Muhammad had entered the bodyguard, he was selected to be one of the soldiers told off to escort the king through the city. The procession was marching on quite smoothly, when a man armed with a dagger rushed out of an alley straight towards the king. Nur Muhammad, who was the nearest of the guards, threw himself in the way and received the stab that had been apparently intended for the king. Luckily, the blow was a hurried one, and the dagger glanced on his breastbone, so that although he received a severe wound, his youth and strength quickly got the better of it. The king was, of course, obliged to take some notice of this brave deed, and as a reward made him one of his own attendants. After this, the strange adventures the young man passed through were endless. Officers for the bodyguard were often sent on all sorts of secret and difficult errands, and such errands had a curious way of becoming necessary when Nur Muhammad was on duty. Once, while he was taking a journey, a footbridge gave way under him. Once he was attacked by armed robbers. A rock rolled down upon him in a mountain pass. A heavy stone coping fell from a roof at his feet in a narrow city alley. Altogether, Nur Muhammad began to think that somewhere or other he had made an enemy, but he was light-hearted, and the thought did not much trouble him. He escaped somehow every time, and felt amused rather than anxious about the next adventure. It was the custom of that city that the officer for the day of the palace guards should receive all his food direct from the king's kitchen. One day, when Nur Muhammad's turn came to be on duty, he was just sitting down to a delicious stew that had been sent in from the palace, when one of those gaunt, hungry dogs, which in Eastern countries run about the streets, poked his nose in at the open guard-room door and looked at Nur Muhammad with mouth watering and nostrils working. The kind-hearted young man picked out a lump of meat, went to the door, and threw it outside to him. The dog pounced upon it and gulped it down greedily, and was just turning to go when it staggered, fell, rolled over, and died. Nur Muhammad, who had been lazily watching him, stood still for a moment. Then he came back whistling softly. He gathered up the rest of his dinner and carefully wrapped it up to carry away and bury somewhere, and then he sent back the empty plates. How furious the king was when at the next morning's durbar Nur Muhammad appeared before him, fresh, alert, and smiling as usual. He was determined, however, to try once more, and bidding the young man come into his presence that evening, gave orders that he was to carry a secret dispatch to the governor of a distant province. "Make your preparations at once," added he, "and be ready to start in the morning. I myself will deliver you the papers at the last moment." Now this province was 4 or 5 days' journey from the palace, and the governor of it was the most faithful servant the king had. He could be silent as the grave, and prided himself on his obedience. Whilst he was an old and tired servant of the king's, his wife had been almost a mother to the young princess ever since the queen had died some years before. It happened that, a little before this time, the princess had been sent away for her health to another remote province, and whilst she was there, her old friend, the governor's wife, had begged her to come and stay with them as soon as she could. The princess accepted gladly, and was actually staying in the governor's house at the very time when the king made up his mind to send Nur Muhammad there with a mysterious dispatch. According to orders, Nur Muhammad presented himself early the next morning at the king's private apartments. His best horse was saddled, food placed in his saddlebag, and with some money tied up in his waistband, he was ready to start. The king handed over to him a sealed packet, desiring him to give it himself only to the hands of the governor, and to no one else. Nur Muhammad hid it carefully in his turban, swung himself into the saddle, and 5 minutes later rode out of the city gates and set out on his long journey. The weather was very hot, but Nur Muhammad thought that the sooner his precious letter was delivered, the better, so that, by dint of riding most of each night and resting only in the hottest part of the day, he found himself, by noon of the third day, approaching the town which was his final destination. Not a soul was to be seen anywhere, and Nur Muhammad, stiff, dry, thirsty, and tired, looked longingly over the wall into the gardens, and marked the fountains, the green grass, the shady apricot orchards, and giant mulberry trees, and wished he were there. At length he reached the castle gates, and was at once admitted, as he was in uniform of the king's bodyguard. The governor was resting, the soldier said, and could not see him until the evening. So Nur Muhammad handed over his horse to an attendant, and wandered down into the lovely gardens he had seen from the road, and sat down in the shade to rest himself. He flung himself on his back, and watched the birds twittering and chattering in the trees above him. Through the branches you could see great patches of sky, where the kites wheeled and circled incessantly, with shrill whistling cry. Bees buzzed over the flowers with a soothing sound, and in a few minutes Nur Muhammad was fast asleep. Every day through the heat of the afternoon, the governor and his wife also used to lie down for 2 or 3 hours in their rooms, and so, for the matter of that, did most people in the palace. But the princess, like many other girls, was restless, and preferred to wander about the garden rather than rest on a pile of soft cushions. What a torment her stout old attendants and servants sometimes thought her, when she insisted on staying awake and making them chatter or do something when they could hardly keep their eyes open. Sometimes, however, the princess would pretend to go to sleep, and then, after all her women had gladly followed her example, she would get up and go out by herself, her veil hanging loosely about her. If she was discovered, her old hostess scolded her severely, but the princess only laughed, and did the same thing next time. This very afternoon, the princess had left all her women asleep, and after trying in vain to amuse herself indoors, she had slipped out into the great garden, and rambled about in all her favorite nooks and corners, feeling quite safe, as there was not a creature to be seen. Suddenly, on turning a corner, she stopped in surprise, for before her lay a man fast asleep. In her hurry, she had almost tripped over him. But there he was, a young man, tanned and dusty with travel, in the uniform of an officer of the king's guard. One of the few faults of this lovely princess was a devouring curiosity, and she lived such an idle life that she had plenty of time to be curious. Out of one of the folds of this young man's turban, there peeped the corner of a letter. She wondered what the letter was, whom it was for. She drew her veil a little closer, and stole across on tiptoe, and caught hold of the corner of the letter. Then she pulled it a little, and just a little more. A great big seal came into view, which she saw to be her father's, and at the sight of it she paused for a minute, half ashamed of what she was doing. But the pleasure of taking a letter which was not meant for her was more than she could resist, and in another moment It was in her hand. All at once she remembered that it would be death to this poor officer if he lost the letter, and that at all hazards she must put it back again. But this was not so easy. And, moreover, the letter in her hand burnt her with longing to read it and see what was inside. She examined the seal. It was sticky with being exposed to the hot sun, and with very little effort it parted from the paper. The letter was open, and she read it, and this was what was written. Behead the messenger who brings this letter secretly and at once. Ask no questions. The girl grew pale. What a shame, she thought. She would not let a handsome young fellow like that be beheaded, but how to prevent it was not quite clear at the moment. Some plan must be invented, and she wished to lock herself in where no one could interrupt her, as might easily happen in the garden. So she crept softly to her room and took a piece of paper and wrote upon it, "Marry the messenger who brings this letter to the princess openly at once. Ask no questions," and even contrived to work the seals off the original letter and to fix them to this, so that no one could tell unless they examined it closely that it had never been opened. Then she slipped back, shaking with fear and excitement, to where the young officer still lay asleep, thrust the letter into the fold of his turban, and hurried back to her room. It was done. Late in the afternoon, Nur Muhammad woke, and making sure that the precious dispatch was still safe, went off to get ready for his audience with the governor. As soon as he was ushered into his presence, he took the letter from his turban and placed it in the governor's hands, according to orders. When he had read it, the governor was certainly a little astonished. But he was told in the letter to ask no questions, and he knew how to obey orders. He sent for his wife and told her to get the princess ready to be married at once. "Nonsense," said his wife. "What in the world do you mean?" "These are the king's commands," he answered. "Go and do as I bid you. The letter says at once, and ask no questions. The marriage, therefore, must take place this evening." In vain did his wife urge every objection. The more she argued, the more determined was her husband. "I know how to obey orders," he said, "and these are as plain as the nose on my face." So the princess was summoned, and, somewhat to their surprise, she seemed to take the news very calmly. Next, Nur Muhammad was informed, and he was greatly startled, but of course he could but be delighted at the great and unexpected honor which he thought the king had done him. Then all the castle was turned upside down, and when the news spread in the town, that was turned upside down too. Everybody ran everywhere and tried to do everything at once, and in the middle of it all, the old governor went about with his hair standing on end, muttering something about obeying orders. And so the marriage was celebrated, and there was a great feast in the castle, and another in the soldiers' barracks, and illuminations all over the town, and in the beautiful gardens. And all the people declared that such a wonderful sight had never been seen, and talked about it to the ends of their lives. The next day the governor dispatched the princess and her bridegroom to the king, with a troop of horsemen, splendidly dressed, and he sent a mounted messenger on before them, with a letter giving the account of the marriage to the king. When the king got the governor's letter, he grew so red in the face that everyone thought he was going to have apoplexy. They were all very anxious to know what had happened, but he rushed off and locked himself into a room, where he ramped and raved until he was tired. Then after a while he began to think he had better make the best of it, especially as the old governor had been clever enough to send him back his letter, and the king was pretty sure that this was in the princess's handwriting. He was fond of his daughter, and though she had behaved badly, he did not wish her head cut off, and he did not want the people to know the truth because it would make him look foolish. In fact, the more he considered the matter, the more he felt that he would be wise to put a good face on it, and to let people suppose that he had really brought about the marriage of his own free will. So when the young couple arrived, the king received them with all state, and gave his son-in-law a province to govern. Nur Muhammad soon proved himself as able and honorable a governor as he was a brave soldier, and when the old king died, he became king in his place, and reigned long and happily. Nur Muhammad's old mother lived for a long time in her son's palace and died in peace. The princess, his wife, although she had got her husband by a trick, found that she could not trick him, and so she never tried, but busied herself in teaching her children and scolding her maids. As for the old hermit, no trace of him was ever discovered, but the cave is there, and the leaves lie thick in front of it unto this day. End of section 26. Recording by Wina Hathaway in Fayetteville, North Carolina.
Section 27 of the Brown Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Brown Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. Wali Dad the Simple-Hearted. The Story of Wali Dad the Simple-Hearted. Once upon a time, there lived a poor old man whose name was Wali Dad Gunjay, or Wali Dad the Bald. He had no relations, but lived all by himself in a little mud hut some distance from any town, and made his living by cutting grass in the jungle and selling it as fodder for horses. He only earned by this 5 halfpence a day, but he was a simple old man, and needed so little out of it that he saved up 1 halfpenny daily and spent the rest upon such food and clothing as he required. In this way he lived for many years until, one night, he thought that he would count the money he had hidden away in the great earthen pot under the floor of his hut. So he set to work, and with much trouble he pulled the bag out onto the floor, and sat gazing in astonishment at the heap of coins which tumbled out of it. What should he do with them all? He wondered. But he never thought of spending the money on himself, because he was content to pass the rest of his days as he had been doing for ever so long, and he really had no desire for any great comfort or luxury. At last he threw all the money into an old sack, which he pushed under his bed, and then, rolled in his ragged old blanket, he went off to sleep. Early next morning he staggered off with his sack of money to the shop of a jeweler, whom he knew in the town, and bargained for him for a beautiful little gold bracelet. With this carefully wrapped up in his cotton waistband, he went to the house of a rich friend, who was a traveling merchant and used to wander about with his camels and merchandise through many countries. Wali Dad was lucky enough to find him at home, so he sat down, and after a little talk, he asked the merchant who was the most virtuous and beautiful lady he had ever met with. The merchant replied that the Princess of Khaistan was renowned everywhere as well for the beauty of her person as for the kindness and generosity of her disposition. "Then," said Wali Dad, "next time you go that way, give her this little bracelet, with the respectful compliments of one who admires virtue far more than he desires wealth." With that he pulled the bracelet from his waistband and handed it to his friend. The merchant was naturally much astonished, but said nothing, and made no objection to carrying out his friend's plan. Time passed by, and at length the merchant arrived in the course of his travels at the capital of Khaistan. As soon as he had opportunity, he presented himself at the palace, and sent in the bracelet, neatly packed in a little perfumed box provided by himself, giving at the same time the message entrusted to him by Wali Dad. The princess could not think who could have bestowed this present on her, but she bade her servant to tell the merchant that if he would return, after he had finished his business in the city, she would give him her reply. In a few days, therefore, the merchant came back, and received from the princess a return present in the shape of a camel-load or rich silks, besides a present of money for himself. With these he set out on his journey. Some months later he got home again from his journeyings, and proceeded to take Wali Dad the princess's present. Great was the perplexity of the good man to find a camel-load of silks tumbled at his door. What was he to do with these costly things? But presently, after much thought, he begged to the merchant to consider whether he did not know of some young prince to whom such treasures might be useful. "Of course," cried the merchant, greatly amused. "From Delhi to Baghdad, and from Constantinople to Lucknow, I know them all, and there lives none worthier than the gallant and wealthy young prince of Nekabad." "Very well, then, take the silks to him with the blessing of an old man," said Wali Dad, much relieved to be rid of them. So, the next time that the merchant journeyed that way, he carried the silks with him, and in due course arrived at Nekabad, and sought an audience of the prince. When he was shown into his presence, he produced the beautiful gift of silks that Wali Dad had sent, and begged the young man to accept them as a humble tribute to his worth and greatness. The prince was much touched by the generosity of the giver, and ordered, as a return present, 12 of the finest breed of horses, for which his country was famous, to be delivered over to the merchant, to whom also, before he took his leave, he gave a munificent reward for his services. As before, the merchant at last arrived at home, and next day he set out for Wali Dad's house with the 12 horses. When the old man saw them coming in the distance, he said to himself, "Here's luck! A troop of horses coming. They are sure to want quantities of grass, and I shall sell all I have without having to drag it to market." Thereupon he rushed off and cut grass as fast as he could. When he got back, with as much grass as he could possibly carry, he was greatly discomfited to find that the horses were all for himself. At first he could not think what to do with them, but after a little a brilliant idea struck him. He gave 2 to the merchant, and begged him to take the rest to the Princess of Khaistan, who was clearly the fittest person to possess such beautiful animals. The merchant departed, laughing, but, true to his old friend's request, he took the horses with him on his next journey, and eventually presented them safely to the princess. This time the princess sent for the merchant and questioned him about the giver. Now, the merchant was usually a most honest man, but he did not quite like to describe Wali Dad in his true light as an old man whose income was 5 halfpence a day, and who had hardly clothes to cover him. So he told her that his friend had heard stories of her beauty and goodness, and had longed to lay the best he had at her feet. The princess then took her father into her confidence, and begged him to advise her what courtesy she might return to one who persisted in making her such presents. "Well," said the king, "you cannot refuse them, so the best thing you can do is to send this unknown friend at once a present so magnificent that he is not likely to be able to send you anything better, and so will be ashamed to send you anything at all." Then he ordered that, in place of each of the 10 horses, 2 mules laden with silver should be returned by her. Thus, in a few hours, the merchant found himself in charge of a splendid caravan, and he had to hire a number of armed men to defend it on the road against the robbers, and he was glad, indeed, to find himself back again in Wali Dad's hut. "Well now," cried Wali Dad, as he viewed all the wealth laid at his door, "I can well repay that kind prince for his magnificent present of horses, but to be sure you have been put to great expenses. Still, if you will accept 6 mules and their loads, and will take the rest straight to Nekabad, I shall thank you heartily." The merchant felt handsomely repaid for his trouble, and wondered greatly how the matter would turn out, so he made no difficulty about it, and as soon as he could get things ready, he set out for Nekabad with his new and princely gift. This time the prince, too, was embarrassed, and questioned the merchant closely. The merchant felt that his credit was at stake, and whilst inwardly determining that he would not carry the joke any further, could not help describing Wali Dad in such glowing terms that the old man would never have known himself had he heard them. The prince, like the king of Khaistan, determined that he would send in return a gift that would be truly royal, and which would perhaps prevent the unknown giver sending him anything more. So he made up a caravan on 20 splendid horses, caparisoned in gold-embroidered cloths, with fine morocco saddles and silver bridles and stirrups, all 20 camels of the best breed, which had the speed of race-horses, and could swing along at a trot all day without getting tired, and lastly 20 elephants, with magnificent silver howdahs, and coverings of silk embroidered with pearls. To take care of these animals, the merchant hired a little army of men, and the troop made a great show as they travelled along. When Wali Dad, from a distance, saw the cloud of dust which the caravan made, and the glitter of its appointments, he said to himself, "By Allah, here's a grand crowd coming. Elephants too. Grass will be selling well today," and with that he hurried off to the jungle and cut grass as fast as he could. As soon as he got back, he found the caravan had stopped at his door, and the merchant was waiting, a little anxiously, to tell him the news and to congratulate him upon his riches. "Riches!" cried Wali Dad. "What has an old man like me with one foot in the grave to do with riches? That beautiful young princess now, she'd be the one to enjoy all these fine things. Do you take for yourself 2 horses, 2 camels, and 2 elephants, with all their trappings, and present the rest to her." The merchant at first objected to these remarks, and pointed out to Wali Dad that he was beginning to feel these embassies a little awkward. Of course, he was himself richly repaid, so far as expenses went, but still he did not like going so often, and he was getting nervous. At length, however, he consented to go once more, but he promised himself never to embark on another such enterprise. So, after a few days' rest, the caravan started off once more for Khaistan. The moment the king of Khaistan saw the gorgeous train of men and beasts entering his palace courtyard, he was so amazed that he hurried down in person to inquire about it, and became dumb when he heard that these also were a present from the princely Wali Dad, and were for the princess, his daughter. He went hastily off to her apartments, and said to her, "I tell you what it is, my dear. This man wants to marry you. That is the meaning of all these presents. There is nothing for it, but that we go and pay him a visit in person. He must be a man of immense wealth, and he is so devoted to you, perhaps you might do worse than marry him." The princess agreed with all that her father said, and orders were issued for vast numbers of elephants and camels, and gorgeous tents and flags, and litters for the ladies, and horses for the men, to be prepared without delay, as the king and princess were going to pay a visit to the great and munificent Prince Wali Dad. The merchant, the king declared, was to guide the party. The feelings of the poor merchant in this sore dilemma can hardly be imagined. Willingly would he have run away, but he was treated with so much hospitality as Wali Dad's representative that he hardly got an instant's real peace, and never any opportunity of slipping away. In fact, after a few days, despair possessed him to such a degree that he made up his mind that all that happened was fate, and that escape was impossible. But he hoped devoutly some turn of fortune would reveal to him a way out of the difficulties which he had, with the best intentions, drawn upon himself. On the 7th day they all started, amidst thunderous salutes from the ramparts of the city, and much dust, and cheering, and blaring of trumpets. Day after day they moved on, and every day the poor merchant felt more ill and miserable. He wondered what kind of death the king would invent for him, and went through almost as much torture as he lay awake nearly the whole of every night thinking over the situation, as he would have suffered if the king's executioners were already setting to work upon his neck. At last they were only 1 day's march from Wali Dad's little mud home. Here a great encampment was made, and the merchant was sent on to tell Wali Dad that the king and princess of Khaistan had arrived and were seeking an interview. When the merchant arrived, he found the poor old man eating his evening meal of onions and dry bread. And when he told him of all that had happened, he had not the heart to proceed to load him with the reproaches which rose to his tongue. for Wali Dad was overwhelmed with grief and shame for himself, for his friend, and for the name and the honour of the princess. And he wept and plucked at his bread and groaned most piteously. With tears he begged the merchant to detain them for one day by any kind of excuse he could think of, and to come in the morning to discuss what they should do. As soon as the merchant was gone, Wali Dad made up his mind that there was only one honourable way out of the shame and distress that he had created by his foolishness, and that was to kill himself. So, without stopping to ask anyone's advice, he went off in the middle of the night to a place where the river wound along at the base of steep rocky cliffs of great height, and determined to throw himself down and put an end to his life. When he got to the place, he drew back a few paces, took a little run, and at that very edge of that dreadful black gulf he stopped short. He could not do it. From below, unseen in the blackness of the deep night shadows, the water roared and boiled round the jagged rocks. He could picture the place as he knew it, only 10 times more pitiless and forbidding in the visionless darkness. The wind soughed through the gorge with fearsome sighs and rustlings and whisperings, and the bushes and the grasses that grew in the ledges of the cliffs seemed to him like living creatures that danced and beckoned, shadowy and indistinct. An owl laughed, "Hoo, hoo," almost in his face, as he peered over the edge of the gulf, and the old man threw himself back in a perspiration of horror. He was afraid. He drew back, shuddering, and covering his face in his hands, he wept aloud. Presently he was aware of a gentle radiance that shed itself before him. Surely morning was not already coming to hasten and reveal his disgrace. He took his hands from before his face, and saw before him 2 lovely beings whom his instinct told him were not mortal, but were Paris from paradise. "Why do you weep, old man?" said one, in a voice as clear and musical as that of a bulbul. "I weep for shame," replied he. "What do you here?" questioned the other. "I came here to die," said Wali Dad, and as they questioned him, he confessed all his story. Then the first stepped forward and laid a hand upon his shoulder, and Wali Dad began to feel that something strange, what, he did not know, was happening to him. His old cotton rags of clothes were changed to beautiful linen and embroidered cloth. On his hard, bare feet were warm, soft shoes, and on his head a great jewelled turban. Round his neck there lay a heavy golden chain, and the little old bent sickle, which he cut grass with, and which hung in his waistband, had turned into gorgeous scimitar, whose ivory hilt gleamed in the pale light like a snow in moonlight. As he stood wondering, like a man in a dream, the other Peri waved her hand and bade him turn and see, and lo! before him a noble gateway stood open, and up an avenue of giant place trees the Paris led him, dumb with amazement. At the end of the avenue, on the very spot where his hut had stood, a gorgeous palace appeared, ablaze with myriads of light. Its great porticos and verandas were occupied by hurrying servants, and guards paced to and fro and saluted him respectfully as he drew near. Along mossy walks and through sweeping grassy lawns, where fountains were playing and flowers scented the air, Wali Dad stood stunned and helpless. "Fear not," said one of the Paris. "Go to your house and learn that God rewards the simple-hearted." With these words they both disappeared and left him. He walked on, thinking still that he must be dreaming. Very soon he retired to rest in a splendid room, far grander than anything he had ever dreamed of. When morning dawned he woke, and found that the palace, and himself, and his servants were all real, and that he was not dreaming after all. If he was dumbfounded, the merchant, who was ushered into his presence soon after sunrise, was much more so. He told Wali Dad that he had not slept all night, and by the first streak of daylight had started to seek out his friend. And what a search he had! A great stretch of wild jungle country had, in the night, been changed into parks and gardens, and if it had not been for some of Wali Dad's new servants who found him and brought him to the palace, he would have fled away under an impression that his trouble had sent him crazy, and that all he saw was only imagination. Then Wali Dad told the merchant all that had happened. By his advice, he sent an invitation to the king and princess of Khaistan to come and be his guests, together with all their retinue and servants, down to the very humblest in the camp. For 3 nights and days a great feast was held in honor of the royal guests. Every evening the king and his nobles were served on golden plates and from golden cups, and the smaller people on silver plates and from silver cups, and each evening each guest was requested to keep the places and cups that they had used as a remembrance of the occasion. Never had anything so splendid been seen. Besides the great dinners, there were sports and hunting, and dances and amusements of all sorts. On the 4th day, the king of Khaistan took his host aside and asked him whether it was true, as he had suspected, that he wished to marry his daughter. But Wali Dad, after thanking him very much for the compliment, said that he had never dreamed of so great an honor, and that he was far too old and ugly for so fair a lady. But he begged the king to stay with him until he could send for the Princess of Nekabad, who was a most excellent, brave, and honorable young man, and would surely be delighted to try to win the hand of the beautiful princess. To this the king agreed, and Wali Dad sent the merchant to Nekabad with a number of attendants and with such handsome presents that the prince came at once, fell head over ears in love with the princess, and married her at Wali Dad's palace amidst a fresh outburst of rejoicing. And now the king of Khaistan and the prince and princess of Nekabad each went back to their own country, and Wali Dad lived to a good old age, befriending all who were in trouble and preserving, in his prosperity, the simple-hearted and generous nature that he had when he was only Wali Dad Gunjay, the grass cutter. End of Story of Wali Dad the Simple-Hearted.
Section 28 of the Brown Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wina Hathaway. The Brown Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. Tale of a Tortoise and of a Mischievous Monkey. Once upon a time, there was a country where the rivers were larger and the forest deeper than anywhere else. Hardly any man came there, and the wild creatures had it all to themselves and used to play all sorts of strange games with each other. The great trees chained one to the other by thick flowering plants with bright scarlet or yellow blossoms were famous hiding places for the monkeys, who could wait unseen till a puma or an elephant passed by, and then jumped on their backs and go for a ride, swinging themselves up by the creepers when they had had enough. Near the rivers, huge tortoises were to be found, and though to our eyes a tortoise seems a dull, slow thing, it is wonderful to think how clever they were, and how often they outwitted many of their livelier friends. There was one tortoise in particular that always managed to get the better of everybody, and many were the tales told in the forest of his great deeds. They began when he was quite young, and tired of staying at home with his mother and father. He left them one day, and walked off in search of adventures. In a wide open space surrounded by trees, he met with an elephant, who was having his supper before taking his evening bath in the river which ran close by. "Let us see which of us two is strongest," said the young tortoise, marching up to the elephant. "Very well," replied the elephant, much amused at the impertinence of the little creature. "When would you like the trial to be?" "In an hour's time. I have some business to do first," answered the tortoise, and he hastened away as fast as his short legs could carry him. In a pool of the river a whale was resting, blowing water into the air and making a lovely fountain. The tortoise, however, was too young and too busy to admire such things, and he called to the whale to stop, as he wanted to speak to him. "Would you like to try which of us is the stronger?" said he. The whale looked at him, sent up another fountain, and answered, "Oh, yes, certainly. When do you wish to begin? I am quite ready." "Then give me one of your longest bones, and I will fasten it to my leg. When I give the signal, you must pull, and we will see which can pull the hardest." "Very good," replied the whale, and he took out one of his bones and passed it to the tortoise. The tortoise picked up the end of the bone in his mouth and went back to the elephant. "I will fasten this to your leg," said he, "in the same way as it is fastened to mine, and we must both pull as hard as we can. We shall soon see which is the stronger." So he wound it carefully round the elephant's leg and tied it in a firm knot. "Now!" cried he, plunging into a thick bush behind him. The whale tugged at one end, and the elephant tugged at the other, and neither had any idea that he had not the tortoise for his foe. When the whale pulled the hardest, the elephant was dragged into the water, and when the elephant pulled the hardest, the whale was hauled on to the land. They were very evenly matched, and the battle was a hard one. At last they were quite tired, and the tortoise was watching so that they could play no more. So he crept from his hiding place, and dipping himself in the river, he went to the elephant and said, "I see that you're really stronger than I thought. Suppose you give it up for today." Then he dried himself on some moss and went to the whale and said, "I see that you really are stronger than I thought. Suppose you give it up for today." The two adversaries were only too glad to be allowed to rest, and believed to the end of their days that after all the tortoise was stronger than either of them. A day or two later, the young tortoise was taking a stroll when he met a fox, and started to speak to him. "Let us try," said he in a careless manner, "which of us can lie buried in the ground during 7 years." "I shall be delighted," answered the fox, "only I would rather that you began." "It is all the same to me," replied the tortoise. "If you come round this way tomorrow, you will see that I have fulfilled my part of the bargain." So he looked about for a suitable place, and found a convenient hole at the foot of an orange tree. He crept into it, and the next morning the fox heaped up the earth round him, and promised to feed him every day with fresh fruit. The fox so far kept his word that each morning when the sun rose, he appeared to ask how the tortoise was getting on. "Oh, very well, but I wish you would give me some fruit," replied he. "Alas, the fruit is not ripe enough yet for you to eat," answered the fox, who hoped that the tortoise would die of hunger long before the 7 years were over. Oh dear, I am so hungry," cried the tortoise. "I am sure you must be, but it will be all right tomorrow," said the fox, trotting off, not knowing that the oranges dropped down the hollow trunk straight into the tortoise's hole, and that he had as many as he could possibly eat. So the 7 years went by, and when the tortoise came out of his hole, he was as fat as ever. Now it was the fox's turn, and he chose his hole, and the tortoise heaped the earth round, promising to return every day or two with a nice young bird for his dinner. "Well, how are you getting on?" he would ask cheerfully when he paid his visits. "Oh, all right. Only I wish you had brought a bird with you," answered the fox. "I've been so unlucky. I've never been able to catch one," replied the tortoise. "However, I shall be more fortunate tomorrow, I am sure." But not many tomorrows after, when the tortoise arrived with his usual question, "Well, how are you getting on?" he received no answer, for the fox was lying in his hole, quite still, dead of hunger. But this time the tortoise was grown up, and was looked up to throughout the forest as a person to be feared for his strength and wisdom. But he was not considered a very swift runner, until an adventure with a deer added to his fame. One day, when he was basking in the sun, a stag passed by and stopped for a little conversation. "Would you care to see which of us can run fastest?" asked the tortoise after some talk. The stag thought the question so silly that he only shrugged his shoulders. Of course, The victor would have the right to kill the other," went on the Tortoise. "Oh, on that condition, I agree," answered the Deer. "But I'm afraid you're a dead man." "It is no use trying to frighten me," replied the Tortoise. "But I should like 3 days for training. Then I shall be ready to start when the sun strikes on the big tree at the edge of the great clearing." The first thing the Tortoise did was to call his brothers and his cousins together, and he posted them carefully under ferns all along the line of the great clearing, making a sort of ladder which stretched for many miles. This done to his satisfaction, he went back to the starting place. The stag was quite punctual, and as soon as the sun's rays struck the trunk of the tree, the stag started off, and was soon far out of sight of the Tortoise. Every now and then he would turn his head as he ran and call out, "How are you getting on?" And the Tortoise, who happened to be nearest at that moment, would answer, "All right, I'm close up to you." Full of astonishment, the stag would redouble his efforts, but it was of no use. Each time he asked, "Are you there?" the answer would come, "Yes, of course. Where else should I be?" And the stag ran and ran and ran until he could run no more, and dropped down dead on the grass. And the Tortoise, when he thinks about it, laughs still. But the Tortoise was not the only creature of whose trick stories were told in the forest. There was a famous monkey, who was just as clever and more mischievous, because he was so much quicker on his feet and with his hands. It was quite impossible to catch him and give him the thrashing he so often deserved, for he just swung himself up into a tree and laughed at the angry victim who was sitting below. Sometimes, however, the inhabitants of the forest were so foolish as to provoke him, and then they got the worst of it. This was what happened to the barber, whom the monkey visited one morning, saying that he wished to be shaved. The barber bowed politely to the customer, and begging him to be seated, tied a large cloth round his neck, and rubbed his chin with soap. But instead of cutting off his beard, the barber made a snip at the end of his tail. It was only a very little bit, and the monkey started up more in rage than in pain. "Give me back the end of my tail," he roared, "or I will take one of your razors." The barber refused to give back the missing piece, so the monkey caught up a razor from the table and ran away with it. And no one in the forest could be shaved for days, as there was not another to be got for miles and miles. As he was making his way to his own particular palm tree, where the coconuts grew, which were so useful for pelting passers-by, he met a woman who was scaling a fish with a bit of wood, for in this side of the forest a few people lived in huts near the river. "That must be hard work," said the monkey, stepping to look. "Try my knife. You will get on quicker." And he handed her the razor as he spoke. A few days later he came back and rapped at the door of the hut. "I've called for my razor," he said, when the woman appeared. "I have lost it," answered she. "If you don't give it to me at once, I will take your sardine," replied the monkey, who did not believe her. The woman protested she had not got the knife, so he took the sardine and ran off. A little further along he saw a baker who was standing at the door, eating one of his loaves. "That must be rather dry," said the monkey. "Try my fish." And the man did not need twice telling. A few days later the monkey stopped again at the baker's hut. "I've called for that fish," said he. "That fish? But I have eaten it!" exclaimed the baker in dismay. "If you have eaten it, I shall take this barrel of meal in exchange," replied the monkey, and he walked off with the barrel under his arm. As he went, he saw a woman with a group of little girls round her, teaching them how to dress hair. "Here is something to make cakes for the children," he said, putting down his barrel, which by this time he found rather heavy. The children were delighted, and ran directly to find some flat stones to bake their cakes on, and when they had made and eaten them, They thought they had never tasted anything so nice. Indeed, when they saw the monkey approaching not long after, they rushed to meet him, hoping that he was bringing them some more presents. But he took no notice of their questions. He only said to their mother, "I've called for my barrel of meal." "Why, you gave it to me to make cakes of," cried the mother. "If I can't get my barrel of meal, I shall take one of your children," answered the monkey. "I am in want of somebody who can bake my bread when I am tired of fruit, and who knows how to make coconut cakes." "Oh, leave me my child, and I will find you another barrel of meal," wept the mother. "I don't want another barrel. I want that one," answered the monkey sternly. And as the woman stood wringing her hands, he caught up the little girl that he thought the prettiest and took her to his home in the palm tree. She never went back to the hut, but on the whole she was not much to be pitied, for monkeys are nearly as good as children to play with, and they taught her how to swing and to climb, and to fly from tree to tree, and everything else they knew, which was a great deal. Now the monkey's tiresome tricks had made him many enemies in the forest, but no one hated him so much as the puma. The cause of their quarrel was known only to themselves, but everybody was aware of the fact, and took care to be out of the way when there was any chance of these two meeting. Often and often the puma had laid traps for the monkey, which he felt sure his foe could not escape, and the monkey would pretend that he saw nothing, and rejoice the hidden puma's heart by seeming to walk straight into the snare, when lo! a loud laugh would be heard, and the monkey's grinning face would peer out of a mass of creepers and disappear before his foe could reach him. This state of things had gone on for quite a long while, when at last there came a season such as the oldest parrot in the forest could never remember. Instead of 200 or 300 inches of rain falling, which they were all accustomed to, month after month passed without a cloud, and the rivers and springs dried up, so there was only one small pool left for everyone to drink from. There was not an animal for miles round that did not grieve over this shocking condition of affairs. Not one at least except for the puma. His only thought for years had been how to get the monkey into his power, and this time he imagined his chance had really arrived. He would hide himself in a thicket, and when the monkey came down to drink, and come he must, the puma would spring out and seize him. Yes, on this occasion there could be no escape. And no more there would have been if the puma had had greater patience. But in his excitement he moved a little too soon. The monkey, who was stooping to drink, heard a rustling, and turning, caught the gleam of 2 yellow murderous eyes. With a mighty spring he grasped a creeper which was hanging above him, and landed himself on the branch of a tree, feeling the breath of the puma on his feet as the animal bounded from its cover. Never had a monkey been so near death, and it was some time before he recovered enough courage to venture on the ground again. Up there in the shelter of the trees he began to turn over in his head plans for escaping the snares of the puma. And at length chance helped him. Peeping down to the earth, he saw a man coming along the path, carrying on his head a large gourd filled with honey. He waited till the man was just underneath the tree. Then he hung from a bough and caught the gourd while the man looked up wondering, for he was no tree climber. Then the monkey rubbed the honey all over him and a quantity of leaves from a creeper that was hanging close by. He struck them all close together into the honey, so that he looked like a walking bush. This finished, he ran to the pool to see the result, and quite pleased with himself, set out in search of adventures. Soon the report went through the forest that a new animal had appeared from no one knew where, and that when somebody had asked his name, the strange creature had answered that it was Jack in the Green. Thanks to this, the monkey was allowed to drink at the pool as often as he liked, for neither beast nor bird had the faintest notion who he was. And if they made any inquiries, the only answer they got was that the water, of which he had drunk deeply, had turned his hair into leaves, so that they all knew what would happen in case they became too greedy. By and by the great rains began again. The rivers and streams filled up, and there was no need for him to go back to the pool near the home of his enemy the puma, as there was a large number of places for him to choose from. So one night, when everything was still and silent, and even the chattering parrots were asleep on one leg, the monkey stole down softly from his perch, and washed off the honey and the leaves, and came out from his bath in his own proper skin. On his way to breakfast, he met a rabbit, and stopped for a little talk. "I'm feeling rather dull," he remarked. "I think it would do me good to hunt a while. What do you say?" "Oh, I'm quite willing," answered the rabbit, proud of being spoken to by such a large creature. "But the question is, what shall we hunt?" "There is no credit in going after an elephant or a tiger," replied the monkey, stroking his chin. "They are so big they could not possibly get out of your way. It shows much more skill to be able to catch a small thing that can hide itself in a moment behind a leaf. I'll tell you what. Suppose I hunt butterflies, and you serpents." The rabbit, who was young and without experience, was delighted with his idea, and they both set out on their various ways. The monkey quietly climbed up the nearest tree, and ate fruit most of the day. But the rabbit tired himself to death, poking his nose into every heap of dried leaves he saw, hoping to find a serpent among them. Luckily for himself, the serpents were all away for the afternoon, at a meeting of their own, for there is nothing a serpent likes so well for dinner as a nice plump rabbit. But as it was, the dried leaves were all empty, and the rabbit at last fell asleep where he was. Then the monkey, who had been watching him, fell down and pulled his ears, to the rage of the rabbit, who vowed vengeance. It was not easy to catch the monkey off his guard, and the rabbit waited long before an opportunity arrived. But one day Jack in the Green was sitting on the stone, wondering what he should do next, when the rabbit crept softly behind him and gave his tail a sharp pull. The monkey gave a shriek of pain and darted up into a tree, but when he saw that it was only the rabbit who had dared to insult him, he chattered so fast in his anger and looked so fierce that the rabbit fled into the nearest hole and stayed there for several days, trembling with fright. Soon after this adventure, the monkey went away into another part of the country, right on the outskirts of the forest, where there was a beautiful garden full of oranges, hanging ripe from the trees. This garden was a favorite place for birds of all kinds, each hoping to secure an orange for dinner, and in order to frighten the birds away and keep a little fruit for himself, the master had fastened a waxen figure on one of the boughs. Now the monkey was as fond of oranges as any of the birds, and when he saw a man standing in the tree where the largest and sweetest oranges grew, he spoke to him at once. "You man," he said rudely, "throw me down that big orange up there, or I will throw a stone at you." The wax figure took no notice of this request, so the monkey, who was easily made angry, picked up a stone and flung it with all his force. But instead of falling onto the ground again, the stone stuck to the soft wax. At this moment a breeze shook the tree, and the orange on which the monkey had set his heart dropped from the bough. He picked it up and ate it every bit, including the rind, and it was so good he thought he should like another. So he called again to the wax figure to throw him an orange, and as the figure did not move, he hurled another stone, which stuck to the wax as the first had done. Seeing that the man was quite indifferent to stones, the monkey grew more angry still, and climbing the tree hastily, gave the figure a violent kick, but like the two stones, his leg remained stuck to the wax, and he was held fast. Let me go at once, or I will give you another kick," he cried, suiting the action to the word, and this time also his foot remained in the grasp of the man. Not knowing what he did, the monkey hit out, fist with one hand and then with the other, and when he found that he was literally bound hand and foot, he became so mad with anger and terror that in his struggles he fell to the ground, dragging the figure after him. This freed his hands and feet, but besides the shock of the fall, they had tumbled into a bed of thorns, and he limped away broken and bruised, and groaning loudly. For when monkeys are hurt, they take pains that everybody shall know it. It was a long time before Jack was well enough to go about again, but when he did, he had an encounter with his old enemy, the puma, and this was how it came about. One day, the puma invited his friends, the stag, to go with him and see a comrade who was famous for the good milk he got from his cows. The stag loved milk, and gladly accepted the invitation, and when the sun began to get a little low, the two started on their walk. On the way they arrived on the banks of a river, and as there were no bridges in those days, it was necessary to swim across it. The stag was not fond of swimming, and began to say that he was tired, and thought that after all it was not worth going so far to get milk, and that he would return home. But the puma easily saw through these excuses and laughed at him. "The river is not deep at all," he said. "Why, you will never be off your feet. Come, pluck up your courage and follow me." The stag was afraid of the river. Still, he was much more afraid of being laughed at, and he plunged in after the puma. But in an instant the current had swept him away, and if it had not borne him by accident to a shallow place on the opposite side, where he managed to scramble up the bank, he would certainly have been drowned. As it was, he scrambled out, shaking with terror, and found the puma waiting for him. "You had a narrow escape that time," said the puma. After resting for a few minutes to let the stag recover from his fright, they went on their way till they came to a grove of bananas. "They look very good," observed the puma with a longing glance, "and I am sure you must be hungry, friend stag. Suppose you were to climb the tree and get some. You shall eat the green ones, they are the best and the sweetest, and you can throw the yellow ones down to me. I dare say they will do quite well." The stag did as he was bid, though not being used to climbing, it gave him a deal of trouble and sore knees, and besides, his horns were continually getting entangled in the creepers. What was worse, when once he had tasted the bananas, he found them not at all to his liking, so he threw them all down, green and yellow alike, and let the puma take his choice. And what a dinner he made! When he had quite done, they set forth once more. The path lay through a field of maize, where several men were working. As they came up to them, the puma whispered, "Go on in front, Fred Stag, and just say, 'Bad luck to all workers.'" The stag obeyed, but the men were hot and tired, and did not think this a good joke. So they set their dogs at him, and he was obliged to run away as fast as he could. "I hope your industry will be rewarded as it deserves," said the puma as he passed along, and the men were pleased and offered him some of their maize to eat. By and by the puma saw a small snake with a beautiful shining skin lying coiled up at the foot of the tree. "What a lovely bracelet that would make for your daughter, friend stag," said he. The stag stooped and picked up the snake, which bit him, and he turned angrily to the puma. "Why did you not tell me it would bite?" he asked. "Is it my fault if you are an idiot?" replied the puma. At last they reached their journey's end, but by this time it was late, and the puma's comrade was ready for bed. So they slung their hammocks in convenient places and went to sleep. But in the middle of the night the puma rose softly and stole out of the door to the sheepfold, where he killed and ate the fattest sheep he could find, and taking a bowl full of its blood, he sprinkled the sleeping stag with it. This done, he returned to bed. In the morning the shepherd went as usual to let the sheep out of the fold, and found one of them missing. He thought directly of the puma, and ran to accuse him of having eaten the sheep. "I, my good man? What had put into your head to think of such a thing? Have I got any blood about me? If anyone has eaten a sheep, it must be my friend the stag." Then the shepherd went to examine the sleeping stag, and of course he saw the blood. "Ah, I will teach you how to steal," cried he, and he hit the stag such a blow on his skull that he died in a moment. The noise awakened the comrade above, and he came downstairs. The puma greeted him with joy, and begged he might have some of the famous milk as soon as possible, for he was very thirsty. A large bucket was set before the puma directly. He drank it to the last drop, and then took leave. On his way home he met the monkey. "Are you fond of milk?" asked he. "I know a place where you get it very nice. I will show you it if you like." The monkey knew that the puma was not so good-natured for nothing, but he felt quite able to take care of himself, so he said he should have much pleasure in accompanying his friend. They soon reached the same river, and as before, the puma remarked, "Friend monkey, you will find it very shallow. There is no cause for fear. Jump in and I will follow." "Do you think you have the stag to deal with?" asked the monkey, laughing. "I should prefer to follow. If not, I shall go no further." The puma understood that it was useless trying to make the monkey do as he wished, so he chose a shallow place and began to swim across. The monkey waited till the puma had got to the middle, then he gave a great spring and jumped on his back, knowing quite well that the puma would be afraid to shake him off, lest he should be swept away into deep water. So in this manner they reached the bank. The banana grove was not far distant, and here the puma thought he would pay the monkey out for forcing him to carry him over the river. "Friend monkey, look what fine bananas!" cried he. "You are fond of climbing. Suppose you run up and throw me down a few. You can eat the green ones, which are the nicest, and I will be content with the yellow." "Very well," answered the monkey, swinging himself up, but he ate all the yellow ones himself, and only threw down the green ones that were left. The puma was furious and cried out, "I will punch your head for that." But the monkey only answered, "If you are going to talk such nonsense, I won't walk with you." And the puma was silent. In a few minutes more they arrived at the field where the men were reaping the maize, and the puma remarked as he had done before, "Friend monkey, if you wish to please this man, just say as you go by, 'Bad luck to all workers.'" "Very well," replied the monkey, but instead he nodded and smiled and said, "I hope your industry may be rewarded as it deserves." The man thanked him heartily, let him pass on, and the puma followed behind him. Further along the path they saw the shining snake lying on the moss. "What a lovely necklace for your daughter!" exclaimed the puma. "Pick it up and take it with you." "You're very kind, but I will leave it for you," answered the monkey, and nothing more was said about the snake. Not long after this they reached the comrade's house, and found him just ready to go to bed. So without stopping to talk, the guests slung their hammocks, the monkey taking care to place his so high that no one could get at him. Besides, he thought it would be more prudent not to fall asleep, so he only lay still and snored loudly. When it was quite dark and no sound was to be heard, the puma crept out to the sheepfold, killed the sheep, and carried back a bowl full of its blood, with which to sprinkle the monkey. But the monkey, who had been watching out of the corner of his eye, waited until the puma drew near, and with a violent kick upset the bowl all over the puma himself. When the puma saw what had happened, he turned in a great hurry to leave the house. But before he could do so, he saw the shepherd coming and hastily lay down again. "This is the second time I have lost a sheep," the man said to the monkey. "It will be the worse for the thief when I catch him, I can tell you." The monkey did not answer, but silently pointed to the puma, who was pretending to be asleep. The shepherd stooped and saw the blood and cried out, "Ah, so it is you, is it? Then take that!" And with a stick he gave the puma such a blow on the head that he died then and there. Then the monkey got up and went to the dairy and drank all the milk he could find. Afterwards he returned home and married, and that is the last we heard of him. End of section 28. Recording by Wina Hathaway in Fayetteville, North Carolina.
Section 29 of the Brown Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Brown Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. The Knights of the Fish. Once upon a time, there lived an old cobbler who worked hard at his trade from morning till night, and scarcely gave himself a moment to eat. But, industrious as he was, he could hardly buy bread and cheese for himself and his wife, and they grew thinner and thinner daily. For a long while, they pretended to each other that they had no appetite, and that a few blackberries from the hedges were a great deal nicer than a good strong bowl of soup. But at length there came a day when the cobbler could bear it no longer, and he threw away his last, and borrowing a rod from a neighbor, he went out to fish. Now the cobbler was as patient about fishing as he had been about cobbling. From dawn to dark he stood on the banks of the little stream without hooking anything better than an eel, or a few old shoes, that even he, clever though he was, felt were not worth mending. At length his patience began to give way, and as he undressed one night he said to himself, "Well, I will give it one more chance, and if I don't catch a fish tomorrow, I will go and hang myself." He had not cast his line for 10 minutes the next morning before he drew from the river the most beautiful fish he had ever seen in his life. But he nearly fell into the water from surprise, when the fish began to speak to him in a small squeaky voice. "Take me back to your hut and cook me, then cut me up and sprinkle me over with pepper and salt. Give 2 of the pieces to your wife and bury 2 more in the garden." The cobbler did not know what to make of these strange words, but he was wiser than many people, and when he did not understand, he thought it was well to obey. His children wanted to eat all the fish themselves, and begged their father to tell them what to do with the pieces he had put aside, but the cobbler only laughed, and told them it was no business of theirs, and when they were safe in bed, he stole out and buried the 2 pieces in the garden. By and by 2 babies, exactly alike, lay in a cradle, and in the garden were 2 tall plants with 2 brilliant shields on the top. Years passed away, and the babies were almost men. They were tired of living quietly at home, being mistaken for each other by everybody they saw, and determined to set off in different directions to seek adventures. So, one fine morning, the 2 brothers left the hut, and walked together to the place where the great road divided. There they embraced and parted, promising that if anything remarkable had happened to either, he would return to the crossroads and wait till his brother came. The youth who took the path that ran eastwards arrived presently at a large city, where he found everybody standing at the doors, wringing their hands and weeping bitterly. "What is the matter?" asked he, pausing and looking round. and a man replied, in a faltering voice, that each year a beautiful girl was chosen by lot to be offered up to a dreadful fiery dragon, who had a mother even worse than himself, and this year the lot had fallen on their peerless princess. "But where is the princess?" said the young man once more, and again the man answered him, "She is standing under a tree, a mile away, waiting for the dragon." This time the Knight of the Fish did not stop to hear more, but ran off as fast as he could, and found the princess bathed in tears, and trembling from head to foot. She turned as she heard the sound of his sword, and removed her handkerchief from his eyes. "Fly," she cried, "fly while you have yet time, before that monster sees you." She said it, and she meant it, yet, when he had turned his back, she felt more forsaken than before. But in reality it was not more than a few minutes before he came back, galloping furiously on a horse he had borrowed, and carrying a huge mirror across its neck. "I am in time, then," he cried, dismounting very carefully, and placing the mirror against the trunk of a tree. "Give me your veil," he said hastily to the princess, and when she had unwound it from her head he covered the mirror with it. "The moment the dragon comes near you, you must tear off the veil," cried he, "and be sure you hide behind the mirror. Have no fear, I shall be at hand." He and his horse had scarcely found shelter amongst the rocks, when the flap of the dragon's wings could be plainly heard. He tossed his head with delight at the sight of her, and approached slowly to the place where she stood, a little in front of the mirror. Then, still looking the monster steadily in the face, she passed one hand behind her back and snatched off the veil, standing behind the tree as she did so. The princess had not known, when she obeyed the orders of the Knight of the Fish, what she expected to happen. Would the dragon with snaky locks be turned to stone, she wondered, like the dragon in an old story her nurse had told her, or would some fiery spark dart from the heart of the mirror and strike him dead? Neither of these things occurred, but instead, the dragon stopped short with surprise and rage when he saw a monster before him as big and strong as himself. He shook his mane with rage and fury. The enemy in front did exactly the same. He lashed his tail and rolled his red eyes, and the dragon opposite was no whit behind him. Opening his mouth to its very widest, he gave an awful roar, but the other dragon only roared back. This was too much, and with another roar which made the princess shake in her shoes, he flung himself upon his foe. In an instant, the mirror lay at his feet, broken into 1,000 pieces, but as every piece reflected part of himself, the dragon thought that he too had been smashed into atoms. It was the moment for which the Knight of the Fish had watched and waited, and before the dragon could find out that he was not hurt at all, the young man's lance was drawn down his throat, and he was rolling dead on the grass. Oh, what shouts of joy rang through the great city, when the youth came riding back, with the princess sitting behind him, and dragging the horrible monster by a cord. Everybody cried out that the king must give the victor the hand of the princess, and so he did. And no one had ever seen such balls and feasts and sports before, and when they were all over, the young couple went to the palace prepared for them, which was so large that it was 3 miles round. The first wet day after their marriage, the bridegroom begged the bride to show him all the rooms in the palace. And it was so big and took so long that the sun was shining brightly again before they stepped onto the roof to see the view. "What castle is that out there?" asked the knight. "It seems to be made of black marble." "It is called the Castle of Albatross," answered the princess. "It is enchanted, and no one that has tried to enter it has ever come back." Her husband said nothing, and began to talk of something else. But the next morning he ordered his horse, took his spear, called his bloodhound, and set out for the castle. It needed a brave man to approach it, for it made your hair stand on end merely to look at it. It was as dark as the night of a storm, and as silent as the grave. But the Knight of the Fish knew no fear, and had never turned his back on an enemy, so he drew out his horn and blew a blast. The sound awoke all the sleeping echoes in the castle, and was repeated now loudly, now softly, now near, and now far. But nobody stirred for all that. "Is there anyone inside?" cried the young man in his loudest voice. "Anyone who will give a night hospitality? Neither governor, nor squire, not even a page?" "Not even a page!" answered the echoes. But the young man did not heed them, and only struck a furious blow at the gate. Then a small grating opened, and there appeared the tip of a huge nose, which belonged to the ugliest old woman that ever was seen. "What do you want?" said she. "To enter," he answered shortly. "Can I rest here this night? Yes or no?" "No, no, no!" repeated the echoes. Between the fierce sun and his anger at being kept waiting, the Knight of the Fish had grown so hot that he lifted his visor, and when the old woman saw how handsome he was, she began fumbling with the lock of the gate. Come in," said she. "So fine a gentleman will do us no harm." "Harm?" repeated the echoes, but again the young man paid no heed. "Let us go in, ancient dame," but she interrupted him. "You must call me the Lady Berberisca," she answered sharply, "and this is my castle, to which I bid you welcome. You shall live here with me and be my husband." But at these words the knight let his spear fall, so surprised was he. "I marry you? Why, you must be 100 at least," cried he. "You are mad. All I desire is to inspect the castle and then go." As he spoke, he heard the voices give a mocking laugh. But the old woman took no notice, and only bade the knight follow her. Old though she was, it seemed impossible to tire her. There was no room, however small, she did not lead him into, and each room was full of curious things he had never seen before. At length they came to a stone staircase, which was so dark that you could not see your hand if you held it up before your face. "I have kept my most precious treasure till the last," said the old woman, "but let me go first, for the stairs are steep, and you might easily break your leg." So on she went, now and then calling back to the young man in the darkness, but he did not know that she had slipped aside into a recess, till suddenly he put his foot on a trapdoor, which gave way under him, and he fell down, as many good knights had down before him, and his voice joined the echoes of theirs. "So you would not marry me," chuckled the old witch. "Ha, ha, ha, ha!" Meanwhile, his brother had wandered far and wide, and at last he wandered back to the same great city where the other young knight had met with so many adventures. He noticed, with amazement, as he walked through the streets, the guards drew themselves up in a line and had saluted him, and the drummers played the royal march. But he was still more bewildered when several servants in livery ran up to him and told him that the princess was sure something terrible had befallen him, and had made herself ill with weeping. At last it occurred to him that once more he had been taken for his brother. "I had better say nothing," thought he. "Perhaps I shall be able to help him after all." So he suffered himself to be borne in triumph to the palace, where the princess threw herself into his arms. "And so you did go to the castle?" she asked. "Yes, of course I did," answered he. "And what did you see there?" "I am forbidden to tell you anything about it until I have returned there once more," replied he. "Must you really go back to that dreadful place?" she asked wistfully. "You're the only man who has ever come back from it." "I must," was all he answered, and the princess, who was a wise woman, only said, "Well, go to bed now, for I am sure you must be very tired." But the knight shook his head. "I have sworn never to lie in a bed as long as my work in the castle remains standing." And the princess again sighed, and was silent. Early next day, the young man started for the castle, feeling sure that some terrible thing must have happened to his brother. At the blast of his horn, the long nose of the old woman appeared at the grating, but the moment she caught sight of his face, she nearly fainted from fright, as she thought it was the ghost of the youth whose bones were lying in the dungeon of the castle. "Lady of all the ages," cried the newcomer, "did you not give hospitality to a young knight but a short time ago?" "A short time ago!" wailed the voices. "And how have you ill-treated him?" he went on. "Ill-treated him!" answered the voices. The woman did not stop to hear more. She turned to fly, but the knight's sword entered her body. "Where is my brother, cruel hag?" asked he sternly. "I will tell you," said she, "but as I feel that I am going to die, I shall keep that piece of news to myself till you have brought me to life again." The young man laughed scornfully. "How do you propose that I should work that miracle?" "Oh, it is quite easy. Go into the garden and gather the flowers of the everlasting plant and some of dragon's blood. Crush them together and boil them in a large tub of water, and then put me into it." The knight did as the old witch bade him, and sure enough, she came out quite whole, but uglier than ever. She then told the young man what had become of his brother, and he went down into the dungeon and brought up his body and the bodies of the other victims who lay there. And when they were all washed in the magic water, their strength was restored to them. And besides these, he found in another cavern the bodies of the girls who had been sacrificed to the dragon, and brought them back to life also. As to the old witch, in the end, she died of rage at seeing her prey escape her, and at the moment she drew her last breath, the castle of Albatroz fell into ruins with a great noise. End of The Knights of the Fish. End of the Brown Fairy Book by Andrew Lang.